Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The Lantern and the Ledger. The rain had a way of softening everything in the valley, softening the dirt roads into ribbons of mud, softening the edge of the pines into ghostly shadows, softening the voices of men gathering round a campfire with their hats pulled low. Nights like that, when the fire hissed against the drizzle and the world seemed hushed but alive, were nights made for stories. And if you listened close, you could hear one in the hiss of the flames and the murmur of the storm. The story of a man who built something out of nothing, not with gold or cattle, but with patience, grit, and a way of seeing value where others only saw waste. That man's name was Eli Cartwright. Now, Eli wasn't born with fortune in his pocket. He came into the world in a shack that leaned more than it stood, raised by a mother who taught him two things: keep your promises and never waste what might be useful. His daddy died early, leaving nothing but a set of worn boots and a lantern that smoked when it burned. Folks in town said the boy was destined for the mines or the river barges, back-breaking work with little coin at the end. But Eli had a stubborn streak. He wasn't afraid of work. He just didn't much care for work that never built nothing more than blisters. When he turned 16, he took that lantern and started walking the back roads, offering himself to anyone who'd let him haul, mend, or tally for a bed of straw and a hot meal. He watched careful, not just with his eyes, but with his mind. Farmers wasted good lumber repairing barns when scraps would do. Merchants tossed spoiled grain without noticing the good kernels could be sifted out. Bargemen underpriced their hauls cause they never calculated the weight proper. Eli wasn't book-learned much, but he saw patterns. He started carrying a little notebook, scratching numbers by firelight with a stub of pencil. It was a rainy evening, much like the one I'm speaking in now, when Eli first realized what he had in that notebook was more than scratches. He was sitting under an awning behind a mill, listening to the wheel creak and the river swell. He'd tallied the loads of wheat coming in that week and noticed the miller was losing nearly a quarter of his profit because he wasn't accounting for spoilage. Eli walked in the next morning, mud on his boots, and laid out the numbers. The miller laughed at first, until Eli showed him how he could save near half a season's wages by changing his measures. By harvest end, the miller bins were fuller than they'd ever been, and he pressed a silver coin into Eli's hand, calling him the boy with the lantern mind. Word traveled. Before long, merchants, farmers, and rivermen came to Eli not just for muscle, but for counsel. He didn't charge much, just enough to keep a roof and a meal, but he asked for trust, and that was worth more. He'd sit with his lantern flickering, working late into the night, showing a bargeman how to tally his loads, or explaining to a farmer why selling a portion now and storing the rest would double his coin come winter. Folks started saying Eli could turn smoke into substance, that his ledger saw clearer than most men's eyes. Now, hear the twist of it. Eli didn't keep his knowledge to himself. He believed prosperity wasn't a prize to be hoarded, but a current that carried everyone who waded in bright. He taught apprentices how to tally fair, showed boys in ragged boots how to mend scraps into tools, even told merchants straight to their face when they were cheating customers. Some hated him for it, but most respected him, for he never bent his numbers, never sold false hope, never lit his lantern on lies. Years passed, and Eli's little notebook grew into ledgers thick as bricks. He never wore fine clothes, never strutted in town like he owned it, but the folks knew, if Eli vouched for you, you were good as gold. When drought hit, men who followed Eli's counsel had stores enough to sell. When floods ruined the harvest, families he taught to save weathered the season without begging. Slowly, the town itself changed. Waste grew rare, trust grew common, and fortune steady, patient fortune to okay root. But hear the part that lingers. The reason I'm sitting here telling you his story by the fire while rain taps the earth like a drum. Eli never claimed his success was his own. He'd point to that old lantern, the one his daddy left him, smoke-stained and humble, and say, "This light don't burn for me alone. It burns for anyone willing to walk steady by it." and so they called him Lantern Eli. A man who built a fortune not in glittering piles but in steady streams, not by riding storms but by digging rivers. His legacy wasn't coin, but the way folks learned to live by patience and promise. The way a town rose steady cause one boy refused to waste a thing. The rain's still falling now, same as it did then, and if you close your eyes you can almost hear him whispering through it. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Eli's story carried on like the slow bend of a river, shaping the land around it without fanfare. As his reputation spread, folk brought him more than tallies and trade questions. They came with troubles heavier than coin, neighbors feuding over land, families torn by debt, men afraid of losing the only thing they owned. Eli never pretended he had all the answers, but he'd sit with his lantern glowing against the dark and listen longer than most. He believed a man's words weighed as much as his work, and if you listened close, you could hear the truth sitting between the lines. Sometimes, all he gave was counsel, soft, simple, rooted in patience. Other times, he rolled up his sleeves and stepped right into the storm with him. It was in those years he faced his first true test. A river merchant named Vaughn, smooth as oil and loud as thunder, came to town promising riches. Vaughn dazzled folk with talk of fleets and fortunes, painting visions of a trade empire that make everyone rich by summer. Many believed him, weary from hard seasons and tempted by dreams. But Eli smelled storm clouds in Vaughn's words. The man's numbers didn't add up. His promises came too quick, too grand. Eli warned the townsfolk, laying out his ledgers plain for all to see. This man's selling floods, he said, and floods always leave mud behind. Still, plenty ignored him. Some mortgaged homes to join Vaughn's scheme, others sold stores they'd saved for lean times. Eli could only stand by, lantern burning, as the tide carried them off. And sure enough, come harvest end, Vaughn vanished with their coin, leaving families ruined. The square filled with anger, grief, and shame. Men who'd laughed at Eli caution now had nothing but empty purses. Eli didn't gloat, didn't shame them. He walked the muddy square, speaking quiet to each family, helping tally what scraps remained. With steady hands, he drew up new plans, ration what was left, share where possible, save small amounts each week. Slowly, painfully, they clawed back from ruin. It wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, but patience has a way of mending what storms break. By the next year, those who followed Eli's counsel had food on their tables again. They spoke of him not just as a man of numbers, but as a lantern in the dark, guiding them through storms no one wanted to admit they'd walked into. That lantern became more than a tool, it was a symbol. Eli carried it into every meeting, every tally, every storm. It smoked and hissed sometimes, but it never failed to glow. Folks said it burned with more than oil, that it held the light of every promise Eli kept, every truth he refused to bend. He never let anyone else polish it, never replaced its glass when it cracked. A man light, he'd say, ought to bear the scars of his journey. Years later, when younger men asked him how he built his fortune, Eli would tell them about Vaughn, about storms that roar but fade, about the pain of watching good folk lose what they had. I ain't rich 'cause I'm clever, he'd say. I endured 'cause I walked slower than the storm. I saved when others spent, I listened when others shouted, and I lit this lantern every night, reminding myself that light don't have to blind, it just has to guide. By then, his ledgers were thick, his apprentices many, his name carried in towns beyond the valley. But Eli never spoke of empire. He spoke of rivers steady, crooked, but endless. He reminded folk that fortune wasn't a treasure chest to stumble on. It was a river you dug with your own hands, fed by every promise kept and every scrap saved. And as the years rolled on, that truth took root deeper than any scheme or storm. Children grew up rested in it as rhyme. Families gathered under rain, speaking it as creed. And travelers carried it to towns Eli himself would never see. What began as a boy lantern in the dark had become the heartbeat of a people. The storms still came, oh yes, but they never lasted. And every time the floods receded, the rivers Eli dug ran on. Eli Cartwright's life stretched into a legend not because of sudden fortune, but because his days stacked like stones, one steady atop another, until they built something no storm could topple. As the years pressed on, his counsel became the quiet law of the valley. Families who once scrambled at every gust of wind now planted steady, rationed careful, and measured their trust with the same precision Eli measured grain. His apprentices, once boys with ink-stained fingers and shaky hands, grew into men and women who carried the lantern lesson into every corner of trade and toil. They kept ledgers not just to count coin, but to count promises. Promises of fair weight, of honest measure, of patience honored even when it pinched. Some of them traveled beyond the valley, settling in towns that had never heard of Eli, yet their way of reckoning spread like firewood sparks carried on the wind. Merchants in distant markets, puzzled at first by these quiet clerks refusing to chase loud schemes, soon realized their steady dealings brought more coin over time than any gamble could. And so the River Way, though no one called it that yet, began to ripple outward. Eli himself aged with the seasons, his hair silvering, his frame stiffening from the countless nights bent over tallies. Still, he carried that same smoke-stained lantern, glass-chipped, handle worn smooth by years of his grip. It followed him into every gathering, lighting town halls and barns when disputes arose. And though he never sought the role, folk began turning to him not just for ledgers, but for judgment. When neighbors quarreled, Eli was asked to listen. When contracts soured, Eli was asked to weigh fairness. He never raised his voice, never claimed authority. He simply laid the numbers plain, asked each side what they promised, and reminded them that storms roar and vanish, but promises endure like rivers. More often than not, that was enough to settle things. Yet even in those steady years, temptation prowled. A new railroad cut through the territory, drawing investors from the cities. Men in fine suits arrived, speaking grand of speed, of profit that could double overnight. They promised the valley folk riches if they'd sell land and sink coin into ventures beyond their reckoning. The old fear stirred again, fear of being left behind, of losing a chance at something brighter. Some of Eli's own apprentices wavered, dazzled by the gleam of promises that sparkled louder than his lantern glow. Eli didn't forbid them. He never forced his creed, but he gathered those willing to listen in the square one stormy night. Rain beat down as he raised the lantern high, its flame flickering through smoke. His voice, though rough with age, carried clear. I can't keep you from chasing storms, but know this, storms don't care who they drown. Rivers don't dazzle, they don't boast, but they'll carry you long after thunder done. Some heeded him, some did not. Those who threw their fortunes into the schemes found themselves broken within a few years, their land swallowed, their coin vanished into city ledgers. Those who kept steady by Eli's counsel endured, not rich in glitter but rich in security. And as the storm of speculation passed, the valley itself stood, steady as always, while many other towns collapsed under their own greed. From that point on, even the skeptics began calling Eli's way the lantern path. When Eli's final years came, he did not die with gold piled at his bedside. His cabin was modest, his boots patched, his table plain, but his legacy was not measured in trinkets. It was measured in barns that stood through storms, in children who went to bed fed, in markets where handshakes meant more than signatures. On his last night, as rain tapped soft against the shutters, Eli lit his lantern one final time. He whispered to the apprentices gathered close, "Keep it lit, not for me, but for the river we've dug together. Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Then he leaned back, eyes closed, and let the flame burn on without him. They buried him without pomp, just a stone carved with his name and the lantern etched above it. Yet year after year, folk came to stand in the rain at his grave, lanterns in hand, whispering the creed that had saved them time and again. And when the apprentices carried his ledgers into the wider world, they carried more than numbers. They carried a way of living, a fortune no thief could steal, no storm could drown. Eli Cartwright, the boy who began with a smoking lantern and a notebook of scratches, had left behind the richest inheritance of all, a law etched into the marrow of men and women, a rhythm as steady as the rain. Eli's apprentices did not let the lantern dim after his passing. They carried it, some literally, some in memory, into towns that had never heard his name, and with it they carried the weight of his words. Each apprentice bore their own bent of his creed. One favored merchants, teaching them that honest ledgers built more profit than inflated boasts. Another took to the farm, spreading the lesson of storing half and selling fair. A third turned toward the river barges, tallying loads so no man was cheated nor shorted. Wherever they went, folks noticed the difference. Disputes settled quicker, stores lasted longer, fortunes, though quiet, grew steady. They began to call these men and women lantern folk, for wherever they set their light, the storm seemed a little less fierce. In distant towns at first there was suspicion. Outsiders always drew wary eyes, but patience wore down mistrust. Lantern folk refused to swindle, refused to chase fast coin. They lent when they could, advised when they must, and never bent their reckoning. When a town saw one of them still standing after a flood or a drought, folk began to ask, "What's your secret?" And the answer was always the same: don't chase storms, dig rivers. The phrase spread quicker than the names of the people speaking it, until even towns with no lantern apprentices were saying the words as if they'd always been their own. Soon, regions began measuring themselves by the creed. Some places fell to boom schemes, rail lines promised but never built, mines abandoned when veins ran dry. Those places emptied, their streets filled with ghosts. But the towns where Eli apprentices had set their lanterns remained. Their barns stood fuller, their ledgers cleaner, their families stronger. Traders noticed the pattern and shifted their routes, seeking out the river towns where promises held and storms passed with less ruin. Prosperity grew slow but unshaken, like a tree root digging deep rather than stretching quick for the sun. It wasn't long before the creed crossed borders. A merchant who'd once learned from Eli apprentice carried the lesson into a bustling city where bright lights and quick fortunes blinded many. At first, folk scoffed, too busy running after noise to heed a quiet creed. But when market crashes came and those who had stored nothing lost everything, eyes turned to the ones who had followed the lantern path. They were steady, calm, still standing while others crumbled. The creed slipped into the city like water seeping through cracks, filling homes, shops, even council halls. Laws began to echo its rhythm, provisions for reserves, penalties for reckless gamble, rewards for fair weight and honest hand. No one remembered Eli Cartwright's name in those halls, but they spoke his wisdom nonetheless. Back in the valley, Eli's grave became a place of pilgrimage. Not for grandeur, no shrine was built, no temple raised, just folk standing in rain with lanterns lit, whispering the words that had carried them through storms. Parents brought their children saying, "Remember this, storms roar and fade, but rivers flow." Generations came and went, but the ritual endured until even those who had never met Eli spoke his creed as if it were scripture. The lantern he left behind was kept by his kin, its cracked glass and smoke-stained frame passed down as relic, not of wealth but of light that guided through the darkest years. And so, a boy with a notebook of scratches and a battered lantern became the seed of a movement that outlived him. His apprentices became teachers, his creed became culture, and his valley became known far and wide as the place where storms lost their teeth and rivers found their strength. The fortune Eli built was not counted in gold nor acres, but in the quiet resilience of a people who chose patience over panic, trust over noise, rivers over storms. The spread of the lantern path turned single towns into networks, and networks into regions that held together like braided rope. These river towns, as outsiders began calling them, built not on flashy wealth but on quiet ties of trust, started to notice something remarkable. When one faltered, the others stepped in. If drought struck a valley, grain came from neighbors. If a river surged and swept away barns, carpenters from 3 towns over brought timber in hands. It wasn't charity, not in the sense of pity, it was investment, a belief that what held for one would one day hold for all. The creed had taught them storms came and storms went, but rivers endured only because their streams fed into one another. Alone, a town could be drowned. Together, they carved valleys. Traders who once passed through these places reluctantly began preferring them to louder markets. Prices were fair, promises honored, disputes rare. A merchant might grumble at first that profits were smaller, but when he returned years later to find the same shopkeeper still standing, still honest, he realized the true wealth of a river town was reliability. No sudden collapse, no vanishing fortunes, just steady trade season after season. Word spread across trails and riverways that if you wanted security, you dealt with a lantern-lit town. Governments noticed too. City officials, burdened with markets crashing and debts piling up, looked toward the region shaped by Eli's creed and marveled at their stability. Some dismissed it as luck, but others tried to codify it, drafting laws that mirrored what river folk had lived by instinct. Provisions for savings, checks on reckless loans, punishments for deceit. They didn't call it the lantern path in their statutes, but the echo was clear. It was as if Eli's smoke-stained notebook had been copied into the very ledgers of law. The apprentices of apprentices carried the flame farther. They weren't all saints. Some bent the creed for pride or profit, but most kept it close, polishing the lessons as they went. In coastal cities, lantern folk taught fishermen to salt away half their catch for lean winters. In mining camps, they showed diggers how to pool coin for accidents. Even in courts, advocates began to quote the creed like precedent. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And though few in those places knew where the words were born, they carried weight all the same. Back in Eli Valley, the ritual of gathering each year in the rain deepened. It became less about remembering the man and more about remembering the law he lived. Lanterns bobbed in the storm-dark square as voices, young and old, rose in unison, not shouting, but steady. Travelers who stumbled on the site often left changed, carrying the memory of lantern light and rain song back to their own towns. They spoke of a place where storms could not swallow fortune, where patience had outlasted hunger. Some called it holy, others just called it wise. But either way, the river towns grew stronger, knit by a creed that no flood could drown. The storms still came, they always did, and always they passed. What endured was not the roar of thunder, but the rivers carved deeper with every season. The fortune Eli Cartwright had sparked with his battered lantern and careful reckoning was no longer one man's story. It was the inheritance of a people, woven into the marrow of generations. The lantern path soon grew into something larger than a string of honest towns. It became the backbone of how whole regions understood prosperity. Leaders in far-off cities, weary of markets rising and crashing like summer squalls, began sending envoys to study the quiet resilience of these river towns. What they found unsettled their notions of power. Here were places with no gilded banks, no towers stretching to the sky, no armies patrolling the streets. Yet the folk were fed, disputes were rare, and stores held through winter after winter. The secret wasn't hidden treasure nor clever law, it was the creed lived daily. Patience in trade, trust in neighbors, endurance in hardship. Officials returned home with reports describing it as an invisible architecture, a foundation stronger than stone. Merchants from crowded ports arrived expecting to take advantage of backwater simplicity, only to discover that bargains in these places were tougher than city contracts. A rivertown farmer might offer fair price, but he wouldn't be rushed, nor would he bend his measure. Storm coin don't last, they'd say. Take it steady or take it elsewhere. At first, city traders sneered, but when years passed and the same farmer stood in the same field, while flashy partners elsewhere had gone under, they returned with respect. Deals struck under lantern light became prized, for they held firmer than ink parchment. The creed slipped quiet into courts as well. Judges, struggling to settle quarrels, began quoting sayings carried from the valley. A promise kept through winter weighs more than a boast in harvest. Whole codes of law were shaped by these simple truths, favoring caution over gamble, fairness over speed. Politicians adopted the language too, though often they tried to twist it for their own ends. Yet even bent, the river had a way of correcting itself. Leaders who promised storms of wealth faded fast, those who governed like rivers endured. Back in the valley, pilgrims arrived not to see monuments, there were none, but to feel the weight of rain on their skin where Eli once stood with his lantern. They left with mud on their boots and whispers in their hearts, spreading tales of a place where patience had triumphed over panic. Each pilgrim carried the creed into their own world, changing the way families saved, the way merchants traded, the way councils judged. The lantern path had become more than legacy. It was contagion, spreading without armies or conquest, only by the quiet power of truth. And so, across the land you could trace two kinds of towns. There were storm towns, loud and boastful, rich today and ruined tomorrow, and there were river towns, steady and plain, seldom rich at once but wealthy in the long flow of years. Folk began measuring themselves by which path they walked. Travelers chose routes not by distance but by the glow of lanterns in rainy squares. Parents raised children not to chase the noise of storms but to tend the rivers that would one day carry their kin. The fortune of Eli Cartwright had ceased to be tale of one man. It was now a current running through whole nations, shaping trade, law, and custom. Storms still roared as they always would, but their echoes grew shorter. Rivers carved deeper, their steady song carrying louder than thunder ever had. And in that song, the world found its rhythm. Generations rolled like the seasons, and the lantern path settled into the bones of the people until it was less practice than instinct. Children were raised on sayings that sounded older than stone. Store before you spend, weigh before you sign, trust only hands that keep their word. These weren't recited as foreign lessons but as truths as natural as rain. Scholars began writing long treatises on why the river towns thrived, filling pages with diagrams and arguments, yet all their words circled back to what Eli Cartwright had once muttered plain: storms roar, rivers endure. Leaders, too, took to claiming they ruled by the creed. Some meant it honest, governing slow and fair. Others wore it like a borrowed coat, speaking of patience while scheming for storms. But time had a way of revealing who truly lived the creed. Loud rulers faded quick, leaving chaos in their wake, while the quiet, river-minded leaders carried their people through famine, flood, and war. Even in distant lands, the lantern path seeped into custom. A family in the mountains, who had never seen the valley nor heard Eli's name, saved seed each year because their grandfathers had done the same. A merchant on the coast, far from river towns, turned away fast talkers and lent only to those who proved steady. In the cities, shopkeepers kept ledgers not just for profit, but as record of trust, marking which customers honored credit through lean months. The creed no longer belonged to a place or a people. It belonged to everyone who lived by it, whether they knew its roots or not. Festivals grew around the rain. In river towns, folk would gather in the square each spring, faces tilted skyward, lanterns glowing even as water poured down. Outsiders who witnessed it thought it strange, even foolish, until they saw the calm in the townsfolk eyes. It's a reminder, they explained. Storms come, storms go, but while the rain falls, we remember that rivers grow stronger. Over time, those festivals spread. Cities built fountains to mimic rain. Miners dripped water from cisterns onto their helmets. Sailors poured cups of sea over their heads before a voyage, all in honor of the same truth. Endurance above noise, rivers above storms. In courts and councils, the creed was quoted so often it became proverb. Contracts carried clauses nicknamed lantern lines, rules that required savings or delayed payment to prevent ruin. Schools taught the path not as history, but as moral law, saying every child should know how to walk slow when the world rushed. And though few remember the name Eli Cartwright, they carried his lantern all the same, not in their hands, but in their way of living. Back in the valley, the creek ran on, crooked and quiet. Eli's grave sat plain, his lantern relic kept by kin who polished it but never replaced its cracked glass. Travelers still came, some out of curiosity, others out of reverence. Many left with nothing but wet boots and silence, but more than a few walked away changed, whispering words they hadn't planned to say. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They carried those whispers farther than Eli himself had ever dreamed. So it was that the lantern path became less a story and more a thread in the fabric of the world. You could not point to where it began, nor name the man who sparked it, for his face had faded into the mist of memory. But the fortune he built was plain in the barns that stood, the families that ate, the councils that endured, and the rivers that carved deeper with every passing year. In time, the lantern path was no longer spoken of as clever practice or even wise tradition. It took on the weight of sacred truth. Whole generations grew up believing that patience, trust, and endurance weren't choices but the very marrow of life itself. Priests in distant temples wove the creed into sermons, saying that storms were temptations sent to test mankind, and only those who walked the river way would stand when thunder faded. Philosophers debated the nature of fortune, but all their arguments ended with the same conclusion. Prosperity that burns quick dies quick, while prosperity that flows steady lasts beyond memory. Even poets sang of it, scrawling verses about rivers outlasting fire, about lanterns glowing steady against the dark. Towns that had never seen Eli Valley still held rituals in the rain. Lanterns bobbed in streets from coast to coast, glowing golden while drops pattered soft on hats and shoulders. Children raised their faces skyward, laughing as water streamed down their cheeks, and elders reminded them in steady tones that storms were not to be feared, but understood. Outsiders who witnessed these gatherings often felt something stirring in their bones. Many returned home whispering the creed, carrying it into places where no apprentice of Eli had ever walked. By then, it had ceased to be inheritance of a valley. It was inheritance of all who endured. In cities, the creed took on a life of its own. Builders designed homes with storerooms large enough for 3 winters. Merchants struck contracts that required reserves before profits could be claimed. Courts punished deception harsher than theft, for a lie was seen as poison that could choke a river. Even rulers began swearing oaths by the lantern path, though some bent the words to cloak ambition. Yet the storms revealed them quick enough, and those who did not live the creed fell away, while their steadier rivals endured. Back in the valley, the creek wound on, its banks overgrown but still murmured in the same tune it had carried when Eli first tallied grain by firelight. His grave remained plain, yet folk still came. They knelt in mud, not praying for riches but for strength to keep walking steady. They pressed hands to the soil and swore to save when tempted to squander, to listen when tempted to boast, to keep their lanterns lit even when storms rattled their walls. Many claimed the air itself whispered back, a hush that steadied their breath. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Over centuries, the origin of the creed blurred. Some said it came from a prophet, others from the land itself, still others from the first rain that ever fell. Few knew the name Eli Cartwright, fewer still his battered lantern, yet his legacy lived louder than any statue or song. It lived in the way families taught their children, in the way merchants weighed their scales, in the way courts measured justice. The storms never ceased. They raged, they tempted, they roared across lands and markets alike. But each time they passed, the rivers dug by patience carried on, deeper and stronger. And so the lantern path became eternal, not tied to any man, but to the very rhythm of life itself. As centuries folded into one another, the lantern path drifted so far from its roots that folk no longer wondered if it had a beginning. To them it was as natural as breath, as inevitable as the turn of seasons. Children grew up hearing it in lullabies sung by mothers who never questioned where the words came from. Farmers repeated it as they sowed seed, as though the soil itself demanded such wisdom. Sailors carved crooked river symbols into their masts, believing it to be the mark of protection. Judges leaned on it when weighing disputes, not as foreign counsel but as the very standard of justice. To ask where the creed began would have been like asking who first taught the sun to rise. It was older than memory, older than man. Yet even as the creed took on the weight of eternity, storms did not relent. Temptation of quick fortune, pride in loud boasts, hunger for sudden gain, these still prowled every corner of human life. And each time the pattern repeated: those who chased storms fell quick, while those who dug rivers endured. Entire empires rose on thunder and collapsed into silence. Meanwhile, river towns, modest and plain, stood long after. Scholars who chronicled history began measuring it not by kings or wars, but by floods and rivers, arrears of noise and collapse, followed by eras of patience and growth. The law of flow, they called it, though none could say who first named it so. Rituals in the rain grew stranger with time, yet always held the same heart. In mountain villages, folk would climb high cliffs to let storms drench them, believing the rain washed away pride. In desert towns, where water was rare, they built fountains that spilled once each year, gathering with lanterns to honor the flow. In ports where ships from a dozen lands docked side by side, sailors of every tongue stood together in drizzle, whispering the creed in accents foreign and familiar alike. Each believed it their own inheritance, never knowing they all traced back to a boy with a smoke-stained lantern and a stubborn refusal to waste. Back in the valley, the creek still wound its crooked path, hidden beneath forests that had swallowed barns and roads alike. Eli grave weathered and sank, its stone cracked by roots, yet travelers still found it now and again. They would kneel without knowing why, some claiming dreams had led them there. They'd sit quiet in the rain, feeling words settle in their chests like embers. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Then they'd leave, carrying the whisper into towns far away, where it blended with countless echoes until no one could tell one voice from another. By then, Eli Cartwright's name had dissolved completely. His lantern was legend, though most claimed it was metaphor, a symbol conjured by poets to explain a truth too plain to be invented. No one guessed that the cracked, smoke-stained glass still sat in a cabin chest, passed quietly down through generations of kin who guarded it not as treasure, but as reminder. They lit it sometimes on stormy nights, watching the flame flicker against old soot, and felt their hearts steadied by the glow. So the lantern path, born of one man's patience and one valley's storms, became eternal not by memory, but by forgetting. For when a creed is lived so deep it needs no name, when it flows through generations like blood and rain alike, it ceases to be story, it becomes nature. And in that nature, storms may roar, but rivers endure forever. As ages stretched further still, the creed was no longer called a path, nor even a custom. Folk began to speak of it as the first law, the foundation on which all else rested. Priests declared that before man learned to shape tools or raise fire, the river already whispered its rhythm through the bones of the earth. Scholars, digging into history's long crumbled to dust, found the same refrain in every age, every people. Storms rise, storms fall, rivers remain. They argued it was proof not of tradition, but of a principle older than mankind, stitched into the fabric of creation itself. To live against it was to fight the very tide of existence. To live with it was to be carried steady through centuries. Civilizations now taught their children not that the creed had been discovered, but that it had always been. Texts carved in stone spoke of patience as the breath of life, trust as the root of time, and endurance as the one gift granted equally to all. Poets compared the flow of rivers to the sweep of stars across the heavens, saying both moved by the same law. Even rulers, often the proudest of men, bent knee to it, knowing their power could last only as long as they ruled by the slow current. Loud kings who sought to blaze fell quick. Quiet leaders who governed like rivers endured in memory long after their thrones were gone. The rituals of rain deepened into rites. In some lands, newborns were held beneath drizzle as a sign they belonged to the current. In others, couples pledged their vows not in temples but by lantern light during storms, swearing to walk steady together when floods came. Entire nations marked years not by wars or rulers but by the strength of harvests saved, the rivers dug deeper, the promises kept. History itself was told in floods and flows, in seasons of roar and seasons of endurance. Back in the valley, the creek kept its crooked course, whispering through roots and stone. No town stood there now, no pilgrims crowded the banks, yet wanderers who strayed close spoke of strange calm. Some claimed to hear the water murmur words, though none could explain how. Others said they dreamed of lanterns glowing in the rain, guiding them though no light burned in truth. The valley remembered, even when men had forgotten. The soil hummed the same quiet tune, eternal as breath. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The name Eli Cartwright was long gone. His lantern was story told in a dozen contradictory ways, some saying it burned bright as a star, others saying it was never real at all. But the creed itself had outgrown all names, all stories. It lived in the marrow of mankind, in the flow of nations, in the rhythm of the universe. It was the first law, not written by hand but carved into the pattern of existence. Storms roared as they always had, and folks still fell to their temptations. Yet each time when the noise faded, the rivers carried on. And so the world endured, not by chance nor miracle, but by walking steady in the current first lit by a lantern in the dark. As centuries gave way to millennia, the first law was spoken of not merely as wisdom for men, but as the very tongue of the cosmos. Astronomers, watching the slow arcs of planets, swore they could see the creed traced in the heavens, their orbits steady, their paths unbroken, storms of comets flashing quick and dying away while the patient stars burned on. Poets called it the river song, saying it was the hum beneath all things, the note the universe had been singing since its first dawn. Children were taught that every raindrop carried a syllable of that song, every lantern flame a reminder of its glow. It was no longer advice nor law, but language itself, the speech of creation. Philosophers wrote volumes describing how storms were only surface noise, brief as shouts in a canyon, while the river was the canyon itself, slowly, steadily carved through stone by the weight of time. The creed, they said, explained why life endured, why nations rose again after ruin, why families found their way through grief. We are not born to chase storms, they declared. We are born to flow. Entire schools of thought rose around it, teaching not how to gain riches, but how to live in step with the river rhythm. Their students walked slower, listened longer, saved more, trusted deeper. And wherever they spread, fortune grew steady. Religions, too, bent toward it. Some declared the river to be divine, the breath of eternity moving unseen. Others wove it into older myths, claiming their gods themselves abided by the law, that even thunder deities bowed to rivers in the end. In lands divided by creed and custom, the river became the one thing all could agree upon. Temples of every stripe echoed the same refrain, though in words bent by tongue and culture. Storms fade, rivers endure. Meanwhile, the rituals of rain grew into pilgrimages. In great cities, folk built vast open squares where water poured from channels high above, drenching crowds who raised their lanterns high in silence. On seacoasts, ships lined their decks with lamps during storms, trusting the glow to carry them safe. Even in deserts, where rain came but once in years, folk gathered around wells, pouring water slow into the dust, whispering the first law as if the ground itself could hear. These rites were no longer tied to a man or a valley. They were tied to the marrow of existence, performed by millions who never once wondered if the river song had ever been invented at all. Back in the valley of its birth, the creek wound on, narrower now, but steady. Forests pressed thick, roots breaking through the soil where barns and roads once stood. Travelers who stumbled near often spoke of feeling their breaths slow, their hearts quiet. Some swore they dreamed of a smoke-stained lantern burning in the rain. They woke with words on their tongue they couldn't explain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They carried those words back into the wide world, never knowing they brushed against the birthplace of what they thought eternal. Eli Cartwright's name was dust, his story dissolved into myth, yet the fortune he sparked endured louder than thunder. It was no longer his nor anyone. It was the cosmos itself speaking through rivers, through rain, through lantern flame. And so long as storms rose and fell, so long as rivers carved through stone, the river song would hum on, eternal as creation. As ages stretched beyond the reach of memory, the river song was no longer thought of as belonging to man or even to earth. It was spoken of as the current that bound the cosmos itself, the silent thread stitching galaxies together. Astronomers with their great lenses charted the spin of stars, the slow drift of clusters, and declared it proof of the first law. Storms blaze and vanish, but patience moves creation. They called the spiral arms of galaxies the great rivers of heaven, their turns no different from a stream bending through a valley. Even time itself was described in river tongue, a current that carried all things steady, no matter how many storms rattled against it. Philosophers wrote of it as essence, the marrow of existence. We do not merely live in the river, they said, we are the river. They taught that every choice made in patience, every trust honored, every promise kept was a droplet joined in the eternal flow. Storms, they argued, were not evil but noise, brief interruptions in the psalm, reminders of what fades. But the river was forever. Students carried these teachings into every corner of life. Merchants refusing to gamble, rulers measuring their reigns not by conquest but by what endured, families holding to one another through winters with faith that patience would bring spring. Religions turned their altars toward rivers, real or imagined. Some carved channels of water through their temples, letting it murmur as prayer. Others lit thousands of lanterns during the rains, each flame a vow to keep steady. Pilgrims traveled oceans just to stand in the path of storms, lifting their hands in defiance and faith, whispering that thunder would pass. On distant shores they sang hymns in 100 tongues, yet all carried the same refrain. Storms roar, rivers endure. Back in the valley, the creek ran on, more hidden than ever beneath centuries of forest. Its voice was small, almost lost, yet to those who happened upon it, it carried more power than any cathedral bell. Travelers sat in silence, not knowing why their hearts beat slower, their thoughts clearer. Some swore they dreamed of a man bent over a ledger, a lantern flickering at his side, though no one knew his name. They woke whispering words they thought their own. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And so the birthplace of the first law still sang, though no ear knew it as birthplace anymore. Eli Cartwright's lantern was dust, his ledgers gone, but what he lit had become the very heartbeat of the universe. Civilizations rose and fell, empires boomed and collapsed, stars themselves lived and died, but the river's song endured. It was no longer story, no longer creed, but the eternal current that carried all. Storms blazed, storms tempted, storms passed. The river carved on, deeper, quieter, unshaken. And so the fortune of one man, once scribbled in smoke-stained pages and lit by a battered lantern, had grown into the inheritance of creation itself. As civilizations reached their heights and fell back into dust, the river came to be seen not only as the law that bound existence, but as the reason it could begin again. When empires crumbled under their own storms of greed, folk whispered that the river had carried away the ruin so that new growth might take root. When plagues and famines swept across nations, the survivors who endured by patience believed they had floated on the current itself, spared not by chance but by the rhythm of the first law. Renewal, they said, was not miracle but the river gift, the way it cleared floodwaters so seeds could sprout again. In this way, patience was no longer merely survival, it was rebirth. Trust was not only virtue, it was the spark of new dawns. Endurance was not just strength, it was the womb of creation. Priests of many lands began telling stories of how the cosmos itself breathed this rhythm. They preached that the stars had not been born in fire alone, but in the river that carried sparks until they steadied into light. Philosophers echoed it, saying that every age of ruin was only storm water draining back into the soil so life could grow anew. Poets, as always, sang it best, verses of rivers that carved valleys not to destroy but to prepare, not to erase but to make space for something stronger. Whole cultures built their calendars around this belief, marking years not by kings but by floods and plantings, by endings and renewals, each cycle a verse in the river song. Even rulers who once feared the creed for slowing their ambition found comfort in it. They began to declare their reigns not as flames burning bright but as rivers flowing long. In courts, lanterns burned steady during judgments, symbols that justice itself flowed slow and sure, not swift and violent like storms. In homes, families passed down sayings as if they were heirlooms, words older than lineage. When the flood clears, plant again. When the storm ends, build again. When the night falls, light the lantern. Always the river waits. Back in the hidden valley, the creek still moved, crooked as ever. Its banks were lined with moss thick as blankets, its waters shallow but unbroken. Travelers who paused there felt a hush that needed no temple walls, no priestly voice. The murmur of water was enough. Some woke from dreams certain they had spoken with an ancestor or even the universe itself. And though their words differed, the message was always the same. Storms fade, rivers endure, and from that endurance, life begins again. The name Eli Cartwright had long since vanished, but the fortune he sparked lived on as the faith that rebirth was always possible. Empires might burn, stars might fall, even worlds might crumble, but so long as the river flowed, tomorrow would rise. And so the creed became more than survival, more than law. It became the promise of beginnings, that after every ending, patience would carve the path for life anew. With time, the river promise of renewal grew into the very star by which civilizations steered their course. Peoples who once thought of themselves as masters of their age began to see themselves instead as caretakers, tending soil they might never harvest, planting seeds meant for children yet unborn. The creed shaped not only the way families saved or merchants traded, but the way entire nations thought of their purpose. Kings who once boasted of conquest now spoke of stewardship, claiming their reign would be measured not by thunder struck in their lifetime, but by rivers that still flowed after they were gone. Councils drew up charters that required stores to be set aside for 7 generations forward, trusting that patience was the truest wealth. Scholars, too, took to writing about the long current, describing it as the flow of time itself, each man and woman but a droplet carried forward, part of something greater than themselves. The Lantern Path, though few remembered the name, gave birth to a culture of legacy. Builders crafted bridges that would outlast them, farmers planted groves that would bear fruit for their grandchildren, and sailors charted safe routes not for profit alone but to guide those who followed. Children were taught to see their lives as chapters in a book older than memory, each choice a line added to a story the river itself was telling. And when storms came, as they always did, folk bore them with calmer hearts, knowing that even if their own days were battered, the current would carry their kin forward. Religions painted the river as sacred covenant. Some carved great channels of water through their temples, letting it flow eternal beside the altar. Others lit rows of lanterns in rainstorms, saying each flame was a vow to the unborn. Festivals shifted from mere survival celebrations to great gatherings of remembrance and promise. Parents lifted their children into the drizzle, whispering that the drops fallen on their brows were the same drops that had fallen on their ancestors and would fall again on their children. In that rhythm, they felt eternity. Meanwhile, travelers continued to stumble upon the quiet valley where the creed was born, though none knew it as birthplace. The creek wound steady through its mossy banks, and the hush of its current worked on hearts like gentle hands. Those who lingered there often left with strange conviction that they were part of something older, something greater, a flow they could neither command nor escape. They carried that conviction home, speaking of the need to build not just for themselves but for the unseen. And in that way, the whisper spread farther still, changing even those who had never heard the name Eli Cartwright. The fortune of one man, once nothing more than steady tallies and a smoke-stained lantern, had become the inheritance of civilizations. Storms roared, floods tempted, thunder shook the skies, but beneath it all the river carried on, unbroken. And in its promise of renewal, folk found not only survival but purpose, to live not as flashes in the dark, but as part of an endless current that would bear their light into ages they would never see. In time, the river creed seeped so deep into the marrow of mankind that it came to shape not just towns or kingdoms, but the whole order of the world. Distant peoples, once divided by tongue, flag, and frontier, began to see themselves bound by a single duty to steward tomorrow. Trade routes, once guarded with suspicion, grew into lifelines where trust outweighed tolls. Councils of nations gathered not to boast of strength, but to weigh how best to preserve soil, seed, and store for generations unborn. Wars, though they still flared like sudden storms, grew shorter, for even victors found no honor in floods that washed away all. Peace was no longer sold as dream. It was understood as the natural rhythm of rivers flowing steady through valleys, their bends patient, their waters sure. Governments rewrote their laws to echo the first law. Charters demanded reserves before ventures. Treaties required time to prove faith before coin was exchanged. Leaders were chosen not for their roar, but for their steadiness, judged by how they endured tempest rather than how they shone in calm. Scholars measured prosperity not in sudden spikes of wealth, but in how long it held against winter. Families, too, kept their focus on legacy. Fathers planting trees they'd never sit under, mothers storing food their grandchildren might one day eat. In every layer of life, from hearth to throne, the river had carved its course. Religions that once clashed found common ground in the creed. They kept their gods and their hymns, but beneath every prayer ran the same refrain: storms are fleeting, rivers eternal. Pilgrimages drew crowds from every nation to stand together in rain, lanterns raised high. These gatherings became more than ritual. They became symbols of unity, proof that the first law bound all people no matter their lineage. Outsiders who witnessed them spoke of a silence deeper than thunder, a calm that stretched across faces of thousands as water ran down their cheeks and firelight flickered in their eyes. That silence was trust itself, breathed out by a world that had chosen rivers over storms. And though the name of Eli Cartwright was long dust, though no one remembered the smoke-stained lantern he once held, his fortune thrived larger than any coin. For what he sparked was no longer a story of one man or one valley, it was the compass of a whole world. The creek in that forgotten hollow still whispered through moss and stone, a murmur too small for maps yet mighty enough to shape nations. Travelers who stumbled upon it left different than they came, steady in step, patient in heart, whispering words they could not place. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They carried that murmur into cities and halls of power, and it wove itself into decisions that would echo through centuries. Storms did not vanish, they never would. But the world had learned at last not to build upon thunder. It had learned to build upon flow. And so the river endured, and through it, mankind endured with purpose, greater than gold, steadier than stone, eternal as rain. When the world had been bound together by the river creed so firmly that borders mattered less than bonds, men and women turned their eyes outward. Seas that once seemed endless became highways, skies that once seemed unreachable became pathways, and at last the stars themselves beckoned. Yet even in that bold age of exploration, the first law held its place at the helm. Shipwrights refused to trust in vessels built quick for glory, choosing instead those crafted slow, each plank checked, each nail true. Captains who led with patience, rationing fare, checking their maps twice before changing course, returned with holds full and crews intact. Those who chased storms of fame often vanished beneath waves or were swallowed by the silence of sky. The lesson was old but eternal. Storms roar, rivers endure. Colonies planted on distant islands or windswept coasts flourished when they lived by the creed. They saved their harvests, lent trust carefully, built their walls steady rather than fast. Settlements that forgot the river often shone bright for a season, then crumbled when the first storm struck. Explorers wrote journals describing the pattern plain. Fortune lasted only where patience had been laid like foundation stone. Philosophers declared that discovery itself was just another bend of the river, that mankind's journey outward was not conquest but flow, a steady current carrying them further than before. When at last ships of iron and fire climbed into the skies, carrying men into the Black Sea above, the river still guided them. Engineers demanded reserves of fuel and food greater than what storms of ambition would have allowed. Crews were chosen not for bravado but for steadiness, for trust proven through winters. And as those ships hung in the heavens, gazing down on the blue rivers of Earth, the astronauts whispered the same creed their ancestors had spoken in rain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. For in the silence of the stars, they knew no thunder could save them, only patience, trust, and endurance. Back in the forgotten valley, the creek still ran, crooked and quiet. Its voice had become no less eternal, though mankind had left its banks far behind. Travelers who stumbled upon it still felt the hush in their bones. Some swore the stars above that place shone clearer, as if honoring the lantern that once lit it square. They dreamed of new worlds flowing like rivers, of light spread steady across the heavens. They woke whispering words they believed to be visions, never knowing they echoed a truth older than their species. So it was that Eli Cartwright fortune, born of a notebook of scratches and a smoke-stained lamp, reached beyond fields, beyond nations, beyond even the sky. It guided sails across seas, wings through clouds, and engines into the stars. The river had become the compass of all journeys, the steady current beneath every voyage, the quiet hand that carried mankind where storms alone could never take them. As humankind pressed further into the heavens, carrying their lantern light into the dark, the river creed flowed with them like breath itself. Settlements on barren moons, domes on red deserts, and stations that hung in orbit like lanterns above the void all found the same truth. Survival belonged not to the boldest storm chasers, but to those who moved with patience. Colonies that rationed careful, stored beyond need, and built trust brick by brick, flourished even in the harshest places. Others, dazzled by quick profit or loud leaders promising abundance overnight, collapsed into silence, their lights blinking out like candles in a gale. The pattern was so plain that historians among the stars began charting it as law, calling it not superstition, but the cosmic rhythm by which all life endured. Merchants who traded between worlds carried the creed in their dealings. They measured cargo with precision, refused to gamble loads on uncertain routes, and honored their contracts even when storms of circumstance pressed hard. Soon the phrase riverborn became badge of trust among the stars, marking a trader who walked steady no matter how vast the gulf. Families on cold moons passed down the same sayings their ancestors had whispered under rain on earth, though they now spoke them under artificial drizzle poured from pipes and domes. Save before you spend, endure before you boast, rivers before storms. And children laughed as drops rolled down their cheeks, never knowing their play echoed rituals older than memory. Councils of whole planets were shaped by the first law. Governors who promised rivers endured centuries, their colonies stable, their people steady. Those who thundered with storms of ambition burned out fast, their ruins floating in orbit as reminders that noise never built what patience could. In time, the river became more than law of survival. It became the identity of humankind scattered among the stars. Folk no longer said they lived by the river, they said they were the river, a current of patience and trust flowing through the cosmos. Back on the old valley, the creek still whispered through its crooked bed. Earth itself was seldom visited now, yet the soil remembered. The water carried the same murmur it always had, soft and eternal. Those rare wanderers who found it in the quiet centuries spoke of dreams that pressed upon them, visions of lanterns in rain, of ledgers filled with careful numbers, of voices whispering steady counsel. They woke with words on their tongue they could not place. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And they carried that whisper back into the black, where it found ears that had never heard of earth but knew its truth as their own. Thus the fortune of Eli Cartwright, unknown to them all, had become the compass of humankind's journey through the stars. Storms of ambition still roared, tempests of pride still tempted, but none lasted. What endured were the rivers dug by patience, flowing steady across worlds, unbroken as the cosmos itself. When humankind at last met others in the deep dark beings wrought in shapes no farmer nor sailor could have imagined, the River Creed proved to be the bridge where no language could. At first there was fear, for storms of mistrust roared louder than thunder. Strangers looked upon one another with suspicion, hands hovering near weapons, hearts pounding quick as floodwater. Yet when the first bargains were struck, the same pattern revealed itself. The ones who chased quick profit rushing into packs of noise and glitter found ruin. The ones who moved patient, exchanging fairly, building trust brick by brick, endured. Soon it was clear, the river was not a human story alone. It was a truth as wide as creation. Scholars of the stars began calling it the convergence, pointing out how every people that had outlasted their own storms carried some echo of the first law. Some sang it different, some carved it into stone, some whispered it in silence, but always it was the same. Storms fade, rivers endure. Alien tongues bent the words in ways strange to human ears, yet the meaning struck true. Even when no translation could capture the poetry, lantern light in rain and the patience of rivers needed no explanation. Trade among the stars began to take on the shape of rivers instead of storms. Contracts stretched across years, measured by endurance rather than speed. Trust became the currency more precious than any mineral. Councils formed not as empires but as currents loose, steady, unbreakable. And though humankind no longer remembered Eli Cartwright nor his smoke-stained lantern, the inheritance of his patience shaped how whole civilizations bound themselves together. Rituals too found new voice. On domes beneath alien suns, humans and strangers alike poured streams of water across stone floors, raising lanterns of their own kind of light. They did not speak the same words, but they knew the same truth. Children of both kinds splashed in shallow pools, laughing, while elders watched with eyes that had seen storms come and go. And in that laughter, in that glow, the river whispered across species, stronger than thunder, deeper than mistrust. Meanwhile, back on the quiet valley, the creek wound on, crooked as always. No pilgrim knew its name, yet the land hummed eternal. The water murmur was the same murmur now sung beneath alien skies, though no one guessed they shared the same root. Travelers still stumbled upon it, felt calm settle in their bones, and left whispering words they thought their own invention. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They carried it into worlds that had never seen earth, never heard of Hollow Creek, never dreamed that fortune could be born of patience scratched in a simple ledger. Thus the river became not only the creed of mankind, but the covenant of creation. Storms raged as storms always would, but from one world to the next, from one people to another, the current carried all who chose to endure. And so the river flowed wider than anyone had ever dreamed, unbroken, eternal as breath. As more civilizations joined hands across the dark, the River Creed was no longer spoken as advice nor whispered as poetry. It became the foundation of interstellar councils. Where once treaties had been written with suspicion, guarded by fleets and sharpened by hidden threats, they now carried the rhythm of patience. Agreements stretched across decades, even centuries, built not on haste but on the slow current of trust. The councils themselves came to be called currents, gatherings where decisions flowed careful and steady, each voice weighing like a stone in the riverbed. It was said that no matter the species, no matter the tongue, the moment the lantern light or its alien counterpart was raised in the chamber, all grew quieter, their tempers tempered by the memory that storms roar but rivers endure. Merchants of 100 worlds began speaking of river coin not as minted currency, but as a reputation earned only by steady dealings. To be called riverborn in trade was to be trusted beyond the glitter of gold or the promise of mineral wealth. Contracts between stars ceased to be secured by blades or fleets, but by the surety of a people endurance. Floods of greed still came, storms of pride still rattled, but the councils endured through them all, not by force, but by the quiet strength of the creed. Children on moons and stations grew up learning rain rites under artificial showers, lanterns glowing in steel corridors. They laughed as droplets slid down their faces, never knowing they were echoing a ritual born under earth-gray skies. In alien temples, priests carried vessels of water across stone floors, pouring it steady as they intoned in their own tongues the same truth mankind had whispered for ages. And in families of every kind, parents taught their young the words and shapes fitted to their language, yet always holding the heart. Storms fade, rivers endure. Meanwhile, the quiet valley where the creed had first taken breath remained unchanged. The creek murmured on, hidden under trees that had seen centuries pass. No monument marked the spot, no record remained of the boy with the smoke-stained lantern, yet those who stumbled upon it swore the air itself carried weight, as if steeped in memory. Some claimed to dream of strangers speaking in voices not their own, all saying the same refrain. They left shaken, whispering words they could not explain, carrying them back into the wide cosmos where the river song already waited. Eli Cartwright's name was dust, but his fortune had grown wider than empires. What had once been scratches in a notebook by lamplight had become the compass of creation's councils, the current by which peace was steered, the promise that kept trade and trust alive across the void. Storms still broke, wars, greed, betrayals, but they never lasted. The river carried on, and all who chose to walk in its flow carried on with it. In the ages that followed, the river creed sank so deep into the lives of worlds scattered across the stars that folk no longer thought of themselves as separate peoples bound by treaties, but as streams flowing into one current. Civilizations that once clung to their own names, banners, and rivalries began speaking of themselves as parts of a greater whole, a river wider than galaxies. They called themselves the flow, not in law alone, but in identity, believing that each world was a bend in the same endless current. History was no longer told in the rise and fall of nations, but in the strength of the river itself, which had endured through storms of war and waves of greed without ever losing its song. Families raised their children to see beyond their own kin or world, telling them that to live steady was to add to the river that carried all life. Merchants, once eager to stamp their names on trade, took pride instead in being called keepers of the current. Leaders introduced themselves not as rulers of planets, but as stewards of streams, guardians of patience who would one day hand their place to others further down the flow. Even scholars who charted the stars declared that galaxies themselves were rivers, their spiral and arms currents of light carrying life through the ages. The creed had become not just a guide to action, but the way people understood themselves. Ceremonies grew grand but never lost their heart. Lanterns glowed not only in rain but in vacuum domes and under alien skies, raised by hands of 100 shapes. Water poured in rituals across stone, metal, and soil alike, symbols of the same truth, that what endured was not thunder, not fire, not conquest, but patience and trust. Children splashed in shallow pools as priests whispered the creed, and their laughter carried louder than any sermon. Even in times of famine or conflict, these rites reminded folk that storms passed and the river endured, renewing faith when doubt gnawed. And yet, for all its universality, the valley of Hollow Creek remained hidden, forgotten. The small creek still whispered as it always had, its voice drowned by forest but never silenced. Wanderers who found it felt themselves part of something vast, though they could not name it. They left speaking words they believed their own. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And those words blended with 1,000 others scattered through the stars until no one could tell where they'd first been spoken. Eli Cartwright was long gone, his lantern long dust, his name erased by time. But the fortune he sparked had become identity itself, a current stronger than empires, wider than galaxies, eternal as the cosmos. Storms still roared, storms still tempted, but the river carried on, and all who lived by it carried on as one. As centuries turned to epochs, the river creed was no longer bound to the rise and fall of civilizations, nor to the dealings of merchants and rulers. It came to be spoken of as the very heartbeat of existence itself. Philosophers taught that the river was not metaphor but marrow, the hidden law that made stars turn and time march. Scientists charting galaxies spoke of currents of gravity and streams of light, describing them as proof of the first law. All things that endure move steady, while all things that blaze too bright are doomed to fade. Priests echoed the same truth in softer tones, calling the river the breath of creation, the song that had been humming since before the first dawn. To live with it was to align with the cosmos, to live against it was to fight the tide of eternity. Civilizations built their calendars not on wars or rulers, but on flows of patience, a res measured by how well the creed was kept. Festivals across worlds celebrated not conquest nor invention, but endurance. A harvest stored, a promise kept, a bridge that outlasted its builders. Whole generations grew to see their lives as droplets in a current, precious not for their size, but for their place in the endless flow. The creed was no longer advice for living, it was the meaning of life itself. Rituals reflected this shift. In temples under alien suns, folk poured water into pools shaped like galaxies, watching it swirl slow as stars. Lanterns glowed in orbiting stations, their light shimmering against the void, a vow that patience endured even in the silence of space. Children were taught that when they breathed, they were breathing in rhythm with the river, their hearts beating to its eternal drum. Even death was no longer feared as storm, but embraced as return to the flow, a droplet melting back into the current that carried all. Back in the valley, Hollow Creek still sang, crooked and quiet, unseen by the worlds it had changed. The trees grew thick, the soil rich, and the water murmured words that no ear heard, yet every soul seemed to know. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The grave of Eli Cartwright lay lost under moss and root, yet his lantern glow lived on in every flame lit across the stars. Travelers who passed through the valley carried with them a hush, a calm they could not name, as if the land itself remembered. And though no one traced their newfound steadiness to that humble place, the river remembered. Thus the fortune of one man, once no more than a light in the rain and numbers scribbled in a notebook, had become the pulse of creation. Storms still roared, as storms always will, but the river endured, steady as the stars, eternal as breath, whispering through galaxies and ages alike. Storms fade, rivers endure. As the ages rolled into immensities too vast for calendars to hold, the river creed was no longer spoken in words, it became rhythm, felt in the stillness between heartbeats, in the hush of galaxies drifting, in the breath of wind across barren worlds. Civilizations that rose in those late epochs didn't even name it, they simply lived by it, as if instinct carved into their bones. Patience was their pulse, trust their marrow, endurance their inheritance. They saw storms not as disasters but as brief ripples in the endless flow, noise that faded while the current carried on. The river had become less a lesson remembered and more a law unspoken, woven into the very fabric of existence. Wherever folk gathered, no matter the world or the shape of their hands, they raised light against the dark. Not always lanterns, sometimes globes of plasma, sometimes crystals glowing steady, sometimes fires kept in simple bowls. Whatever the form, it was the same promise, the flame would endure beyond the storm. Water too was poured in rituals, though in some places it was real rain, in others recycled drops in domes, in others only symbols etched in stone. The gesture mattered more than the substance. It was the vow itself that tied them all together, the vow to flow steady, to endure, to trust. Philosophers of those late ages wrote sparingly, for words had grown too small for the truth they sought to hold. The river is not beside us, one wrote, it is us. Scientists, gazing at the slow death of stars, confirmed the same in their own way. They spoke of entropy, of light fading, of systems unraveling, yet always noted the patterns that persisted, the quiet flows that endured longer than the roars. Even the universe itself, they said, is a river storming bright, fading slow, yet always carrying forward. Back in the forgotten valley of Hollow Creek, the creek still whispered, crooked and faithful. The trees thickened, the soil deepened, but the water song remained unchanged. No pilgrim marked it, no monument crowned it, but the land remembered. The current hummed words that had long since outgrown human tongues, don't chase storms, dig rivers. And though no living soul tied their faith to that place, the murmur of its waters was the same murmur now felt in galaxies far away, where folk lived steady without ever knowing whose lantern first lit the way. Eli Cartwright's name was gone, his story dust, yet his fortune was eternal. What began as a boy refusing to waste, scratching figures in a notebook by lantern light, had become the very rhythm of the cosmos. Storms still came as they always must, but their echoes grew softer. The river carried on, steady and endless, its song no longer spoken, no longer sung, but breathed by all creation alike. As stars began to dim and galaxies thinned into lonely strands of light, the river rhythm endured as the last inheritance of existence. Civilizations that had spread wide across the void learned to gather close, not for conquest, but for company, whispering patience into the silence. They built sanctuaries where light still glowed, not as monuments to pride, but as lanterns against the growing dark. Every flame was a vow that the creed lived on, even when thunder had faded and storms had no strength left to roar. Folk no longer argued whether the river was wisdom, law, or myth. It had become the marrow of survival itself, the quiet knowledge that life would endure so long as it flowed steady. Philosophers of that twilight age wrote in tones soft as embers. "We are carried," they said. "The river bears us through endings into beginnings, through silence into song." Scientists studying the last pulses of energy in the heavens agreed in their own language. They charted the ebb of light, the slow unraveling of time, and yet found patterns still humming steady flows that whispered endurance even as the cosmos aged. They declared that the first law was not only human truth, not only cultural creed, but the very script of the universe itself. Storms blazed and died, rivers alone carved on, rituals continued, though they grew quieter. Families lit lanterns in domes on barren worlds, their glow faint but stubborn. Children played in water recycled 1,000 times, laughing as droplets kissed their cheeks, never knowing they echoed rites older than stars. In temples carved into rock, priests poured final bowls of water onto altars, the trickle sounding louder than thunder in the hush. And across the fading galaxies, voices still murmured the creed, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes only in the slow rhythm of breath. Back in the valley of Hollow Creek, earth itself lay empty of people, yet the creek still wound its crooked way through moss and stone. Its voice had not faltered. Rain fed it, roots drank from it, and the soil remembered. If the universe itself could listen, it might have recognized its own reflection in that small murmur. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The land carried the same truth it always had, though no human ear remained to hear it. Eli Cartwright's story was gone, his lantern long returned to ash, yet his fortune had never been coin nor land. It had been this, that a truth sparked in a boy notebook could outlast empires, outlast stars, outlast even memory. The river endured as it always had, as it always would, eternal as breath in the fading dark. When the last great suns guttered and went cold, when galaxies thinned into whispers and the night stretched without end, the river rhythm still flowed unseen. No lanterns burned in the dark, no songs rose from the mouths of men or strangers, yet the current carried on, steady as it had been since the first dawn. There were no longer markets to tally nor fields to sow, no storms left to roar, but the memory of storms lingered like echoes in stone, and the river answer lingered louder still. It was no longer a creed spoken, nor a law practiced. It was the quiet pulse of existence itself, beating on even when light was gone. Philosophers of the dusk ages had written that this day would come, when thunder would fall silent and only the river would remain. It does not need voices, they had said. It does not need flame. It is written into the marrow of all things. When the last storm fades, the river will still hum. And so it was. No ear remained to hear it, yet the current endured, holding in its flow the long memory of all who had trusted it. Farmers who had stored grain against famine, sailors who had steered steady through flood, merchants who had weighed honest scales, families who had raised children by patience. Their names were gone, their worlds were dust, but their endurance lived on in the flow, a current stronger than time itself. If the cosmos could dream, it dreamed in rivers. The ebb of collapsed stars, the drift of cold worlds, the faint hiss of particles still moving through the void. All of it whispered the same refrain. Storms pass, rivers endure. And in that hush, the river was more eternal than ever, free of noise, free of pride, carrying forward the seed of renewal that no storm could erase. Back on earth, buried beneath ages of silence, Hollow Creek still lay crooked through moss and stones. Rain still fell on its valley, feeding its murmur though no life walked its banks. The water whispered the same words it always had. though now they were not meant for men but for the universe itself. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And perhaps in that echo, the cosmos heard its own heart speaking back. Eli Cartwright's lantern was long gone, but the glow it once held now burned in the marrow of creation. His fortune had never been coin or land. It had been this rhythm, born in patience, carried in trust, eternal as the river itself. Storms had roared and died, rivers had carried on. And so in the last hush of time, the river flowed still, unbroken, eternal, whispering into the dark. Storms fade, rivers endure. Even in the vast stillness after the last stars had gone dark, the river did not cease. It moved without motion, sang without sound, a hidden current woven through the fabric of the void. Though no eyes watched and no ears listened, the flow carried within it every echo of patience ever lived, every trust ever honored, every promise ever kept. Storms had burned themselves out long ago, their roar forgotten, but the endurance of rivers had left behind something the silence could not swallow, the seed of renewal. For in every current, no matter how faint, there lingers the power to carve anew. The philosophers of twilight ages had written that the river was never about what was, but what would be. They believed that even as the cosmos dimmed, the current held the pattern of life, waiting for its chance to stir again. And in that endless dark, small flickers began. Particles collided, faint pulses of energy stirring where none should be. It was as if the river itself was dreaming, carrying sparks like seeds in its flow. No voice named it, no hand guided it, but patience alone was enough. Out of silence, renewal began. Civilizations were long gone, their songs dust, their lanterns ash, yet the creed they once carried had not died. It had become the very marrow of creation. Renewal did not come as thunder, nor as blazing storm, but as slow, quiet pulse. In the hush, the river carved again, preparing soil where no soil had been, whispering the same refrain it always had. Storms fade, rivers endure. And in that whisper, beginnings stirred. Back on the valley of Hollow Creek, earth itself lay beneath eons of quiet. The creek bed still wound crooked through stone, and though its banks were empty of men, rain still fell. Drops gathered, streams swelled, and for a moment the murmur of water sounded louder than the silence of the universe. No pilgrim came, no hand lit a lantern, yet the message remained, etched into soil and current alike. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That whisper was not for men anymore, but for creation itself, reminding it that the flow endures, that from patience new dawns rise. Eli Cartwright's fortune had outlived not only his name, not only his kind, but the cosmos that once held them. A boy with a smoke-stained lantern had lit a truth that could not be drowned, a truth that became the seed of beginnings after every ending. And so, in the deepest hush, renewal took its first breath, not in thunder, but in the patient song of the river. From the silence that stretched longer than ages, the river patience finally bore fruit. Tiny sparks that had once drifted quiet in the dark began to gather, pulled not by chance alone, but by the hidden current that had always endured. Where storms had long ago roared and died, new warmth bloomed, faint as a lantern first flickered. Particles kissed, wove together, and birthed light again, not in a roar, not in sudden blaze, but in steady glow, as if the river itself was setting a new course. The cosmos, emptied and hushed, found its breath once more. Philosophers of the dawn that followed, though they were not the same kind as those who had walked Hollow Creek, would later write that the river never ends, only bends. They spoke of creation as a cycle, storms rising and vanishing, rivers deepening and carrying forward seeds unseen. And in those newborn galaxies, in the swirl of light that rose fresh, the first law breathed again. Worlds formed, rivers carved valleys, life stirred. And though no tongue could remember Eli Cartwright, nor the smoke-stained lantern he once held, his fortune lived in the marrow of this new dawn. Patience, trust, endurance, they were not learned anew, but remembered, as if carried in the bones of existence itself. In that beginning, children of strange forms would splash in waters, laughing as drops ran down their cheeks, not knowing they echoed laughter from countless ages past. Families would store harvests, merchants would weigh scales, rulers would swear oaths by steady flame, and always, In whispers, in dreams, in the hush between storms, the same refrain returned. Storms fade, rivers endure. It was spoken in tongues no human ear had known, sung in accents strange and beautiful, yet its heart was unchanged. The river had carried it through the silence and delivered it to new life. Back in the valley of Hollow Creek, though earth itself was now only dust in memory, the shape of that land endured in echo. Its creek, crooked and humble, had once birthed a fortune that outlived universes. No pilgrim walked its banks, no lantern glowed in its square, but the soil remembered. The murmur of water had become the hum of creation itself, whispering still. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That whisper was the seed of dawn, the compass of beginnings, the light by which all future lanterns would glow. Eli's name was gone, but his fortune had become eternal renewal. A boy with a battered notebook and a smoking lamp had once tallied grain, and from that small act of patience the cosmos itself learned to endure. In the new dawn, as light spread again across the void, the river song carried on, unbroken, eternal, as steady as rain that always falls, as sure as rivers that always carve. From the first dawn of that new creation, the river whisper wound itself through every spark of life. The galaxies bloomed like meadows after rain, stars blossoming in spirals that mirrored currents long gone, and on the newborn worlds rivers carved valleys once more. Out of soil and stone, life rose, strange forms unfamiliar to the eyes of the past, yet carrying in their marrow the same rhythm. They built not with memory, for memory had been washed away in the silence, but with instinct, as if patience and endurance had been written into the pulse of creation itself. Their first shelters were simple, their first trades humble, yet from the start they carried a sense that storms would roar and fade, while what endured was the slow, steady flow of trust. Civilizations began again. Children laughed in the drizzle of fresh rains, parents taught them to store before they spent, and elders reminded them that every promise kept was a stone laid in the riverbed. They did not know they were echoing rituals of an age long lost, they only knew it felt true. Leaders rose, some boasting loud as thunder, promising fortunes overnight. They fell quick, swept away by floods of their own pride. Others led quiet, tending fields, weighing scales fair, walking slower than the storm. These endured, their names remembered, their ways followed. So once more, the river carved, bending civilizations toward patience and trust, never shouting, never boasting, just flowing on. Rituals bloomed too, as natural as breath. Lanterns, though made from new shapes and strange materials, were lit against storms, their glow steady as old promises. Rain rites sprang up, folk gathering in squares or valleys, letting water fall on their brows as they whispered words they thought were their own. Storms passed, rivers endured. They carved symbols into stone, rivers winding crooked and endless, marks of honor and hope. Poets sang again of rivers outlasting fire, of light carrying steady through dark. Though their tongues were strange, the song was the same, and still, somewhere beyond their knowing, the valley of Hollow Creek remained, its soil folded into the memory of a cosmos reborn. The creek, humble and crooked, had once carried the seed of all this, and in the murmur of its waters the same truth whispered still. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That whisper had crossed endings and beginnings, carried through silence, and now flowed once more in laughter, in trade, in lantern light. Eli Cartwright's tale was gone, his name dust upon dust, but the fortune he sparked lived eternal. A smoke-stained lantern in a forgotten valley had lit a creed that outlived empires, outlived scars, outlived even death itself. And in this new creation, as in everyone to come, the river carried on, steady as ever, eternal as breath. The newborn cultures of that fresh cosmos began to root themselves in the river rhythm without ever knowing they followed footsteps trod in ages past. Their first markets rose along crooked waterways, where traders learned quick that honesty brought more return than deceit. Laws were written not in thunderous decree, but in patient ledgers that counted not only coin but promises. Songs echoed across valleys and plains, not celebrating conquest but endurance. Ballads of harvest stored, of floods survived, of lantern light carried through storms. Folk began to say that fortune itself was a river, steady and endless, and that a man's worth was measured not by how bright he burned in a season, but by how long he endured in the flow. Leaders in those early days found themselves tested as always. Some sought storms, gathering wealth in bursts of greed, promising their people riches overnight. Their reigns ended in collapse, their names remembered only as warnings. Others built slow, weighing each choice, tending their people as a farmer tends soil. Their reigns endured, and their names became touchstones of wisdom. In time, councils formed to guard the riverway, assemblies where every voice weighed like a stone, where no storm could drown out patience. They did not call it by any old name, for Eli was long forgotten, but they knew its truth as surely as they knew breath itself. Families raised their children with sayings that echoed ancient creeds: save before you spend, wait before you leap, rivers before storms. Lanterns, strange in shape yet steady in glow, burned in homes through long nights. Rain festivals marked the turn of seasons, folk gathering to let drops run down their cheeks as they spoke the vow to endure. Even in dry lands where water was scarce, folk mimicked the rite with sand or light, knowing the gesture itself carried the meaning. It was not ritual borrowed, it was instinct returned, the river whisper flowing again through marrow. And though they never knew, the valley of Hollow Creek lived in them still. Its crooked creek, its whisper through soil and stone, had seeded this inheritance. No pilgrim walked its banks now, no lantern glowed on its square, yet the murmur remained, echoing into a cosmos that carried its truth. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Those words had crossed deaths of sons, silences of ages, to rise again in this dawn, shape and lives anew. Eli Cartwright's story was gone beyond recovering, but his fortune lived louder than memory. From his smoke-stained lamp and his simple tallies had grown a law eternal, reborn in every creation, carried in every dawn. And so the river flowed on, unbroken, whispering still through new mouths, new songs, new lives. Storms fade, rivers endure. In the centuries that followed, the river whisper deepened from instinct into the backbone of civilizations. Trade routes stretched across continents of this new cosmos, and at their heart lay not speed nor gamble but trust. Merchants learned to weigh goods with precision, for a false measure was treated as poison that could choke a whole stream. Markets thrived not on chaos but on rhythm, each stall and each exchange like droplets joining into a steady current. Folk began to speak of river coin, not minted by kings but earned through reputation, a name that meant patience, honesty, and endurance. To be called riverborn was the highest praise a trader could hear, for it meant your word flowed steadier than any written contract. Justice, too, was shaped by the creed. Councils sat with lanterns burning in silence, listening longer than they spoke. Disputes were not rushed to verdict but sifted slow, every voice weighing like stone in the riverbed. Laws punished deceit harsher than theft, for storms of lies could tear apart banks carefully built over generations. Those who endured their judgments, though harsh, found them fair, and over time folk came to trust the councils more than thrones or armies. The lantern became symbol of law itself, steady, scarred, smoking sometimes, but unbroken. Dreams of the future were cast in the same light. Leaders taught their people to build not for one season, but for 7, to plant trees whose shade they would never sit beneath. Songs sung by children spoke not of glory seized, but of rivers carved. Poets told stories of storms as teachers, warning against haste, praising the patience that outlasted them. Even architects designed cities like currents, their roads bending not straight and quick but meandering, flowing around hills and rivers as if bowing to the law itself. And though these civilizations knew not the name Eli Cartwright, nor the crooked creek where his lantern once burned, his fortune pulsed in all they did. The valley of Hollow Creek lay buried in time, its water still whispering unseen. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That murmur carried across ages and galaxies, through silences and rebirths, to shape the marrow of these new worlds. Storms still rose, schemes of greed, boasts of pride, tempests of ambition, but they never lasted. Each time the river endured, carrying on, patient as ever. And in the glow of their lanterns, in the laughter of their children, in the slow current of their laws, civilizations found wealth greater than gold, the wealth of endurance, the fortune of flow. As the centuries widened into millennia, the civilizations that had grown steady by the river creed began to braid themselves together into vast networks folk came to call river nations. No empire bound them, no crown ruled over all, but their ties were stronger than conquest. They traded across seas and skies not with suspicion, but with quiet faith. Each nation lent into another in lean times, each sharing surplus when storms struck. Their treaties were not weapons but promises, carved into ledgers and sealed not with swords but with lantern light. And the strange thing was this: These bonds endured longer than any empire before, for they were not forged in fire but in flow. River nations measured their wealth not in gold or armies, but in the resilience of their people. Councils met under banners of many colors, yet all shared the same symbol, a flame or light, steady against the dark. They spoke slow, voted steady, and built charters that stretched far beyond one lifetime. Where other ages of history had chased storms of conquest and collapse, these river nations flowed on, bending and curving like streams but never breaking. Their trade networks became lifelines, their laws currents, their people droplets in a vast tide. Culture blossomed under such steadiness. Poets filled squares with verses of rivers cutting through mountains. Children sang rhymes about saving in summer for winter lean. Architects built bridges that outlasted dynasties, cities that curved like meanders of streams. Farmers passed down harvest festivals where water was poured back to the soil in gratitude, a ritual born of memory older than language. Priests in temples of many faiths lifted bowls of rain, chanting the same creed in words different yet true. Storms fade, rivers endure. Still, storms came, schemes of greed, rulers who promised sudden glory, traders who cut corners for faster gain, and still they passed. For the river nations had grown wise to storms they endured, waiting out the noise until only flow remained. The creed had become not merely tradition but instinct, marrow deeper than memory. A child raised in any of those lands could tell you without hesitation. Patience is wealth, trust is coin, endurance is the only fortune that lasts. And though the valley of Hollow Creek was forgotten utterly, its crooked creek still hummed. Rain still fell, water still ran, soil still whispered the words that once carried through a boy lantern into the marrow of the cosmos. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The folk of the New Worlds never knew that their fortune traced back to that humble valley, yet they lived by its truth every day. Eli Cartwright's story had dissolved into dust long ago, but his fortune had never been his name. It had been this current, now wide as nations, steady as galaxies, eternal as the breath of creation itself. And so the river nations flowed on, unbroken, their strength not in thunder but in patience, their legacy not in monuments but in endurance. The river nations, bound not by conquest but by trust, began to sense that their separate streams were part of one greater current. Little by little, their councils, once local, grew into gatherings of continents and then into assemblies of the whole world. They did not call themselves an empire. There was no crown, no capital, but a harmony, a flow too wide for one hand to command. In those halls of stone, wood, or steel, lanterns of many shapes glowed side by side, each flame a vow that patience and endurance guided them above all storms. No matter the tongue or banner, every delegate knew the same truth. Thunder might rattle the earth, but only rivers carve valleys that last. This harmony shaped every corner of life. Trade moved smoother than ever, each shipment guaranteed not by force of arms but by the long memory of honest dealings. Disputes between nations, once sparks for war, were now carried to councils where voices spoke slow and measured, weighing each promise as though it were a stone in the bed of a stream. Children learned history not as a chain of kings and battles, but as a song of rivers bending through time, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide, always steady. Farmers taught their kin to save seed for tomorrow, and architects raised bridges meant to outlast centuries, each stone laid with reverence to the flow. Even faiths that had once clashed found unity in the river creed. Priests of every tradition lifted bowls of water in ritual, pouring them onto soil as symbol that life endures only when fed by patience. Lantern festivals spread across oceans, nights where millions raised their lights together, standing in silence as rain fell soft. Outsiders who once saw themselves as strangers felt kinship in that hush, for in the glow of steady flame they understood that storms faded, rivers endured, and all of them were carried by the same current. Storms still rose. Now and then a ruler promised sudden greatness, a merchant sought wealth too quick, a people grew restless and tempted. But the harmony endured them all. It had learned to wait, to let storms burn themselves out while the river carried on. Each failure of thunder only deepened the world faith in patience. Folk whispered, sometimes in awe, sometimes in gratitude, that the river had become more than guide. It was their identity, their inheritance, the marrow of their world. And though no one remembered the crooked little creek of Hollow Creek, nor the boy who once bent over a smoke-stained lantern, his fortune lived in every vow, every contract, every flame raised against the dark. The valley lay quiet, its murmurs still whispering, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers," though no ear remained to hear. Yet its truth had shaped a harmony that spanned the globe, steady, and unbroken as the current itself. Eli Cartwright's name was gone, but his fortune had never been his name. It was the flow. And now the flow had become the life of the world entire, eternal as rain, unbroken as rivers, stronger than any storm. From the harmony of a single world, the river creed began to reach outward once more, carried on sails of light and engines of fire into the greater sea of stars. The river nations, steady in their bonds, sent explorers not as conquerors but as keepers of flow. Their ships bore no banners of dominance, only lanterns burning at their prows, symbols of patience guiding them through the vast dark. And wherever they landed, whether on moons crusted with ice, worlds wrapped in storm, or barren stones circling distant suns, they brought the same truth. Storms roar, rivers endure. Colonies built under strange skies grew steady when they lived by the creed. They rationed careful, trusted slowly, stored for winters even when summers seemed endless. And when storms came, as storms always did, they endured. Outposts that ignored the river, that chased quick profit or boasted too loud, soon fell silent, their lights extinguished. Word spread through the stars that survival did not belong to the boldest, nor to the loudest, but to the patient, to those who dug rivers instead of chasing storms. Trade routes stretched across star systems, and folk began speaking of currents rather than lanes. Merchant fleets moved like steady streams, never rushing, never breaking, flowing with the rhythm of trust. Worlds that joined the current prospered, their people safe, their children steady. Those that resisted often fell into chaos, swept away by storms of greed or pride. The lesson was old but eternal. Thunder dazzled, but rivers endured. Councils formed between planets, vast assemblies lit by lanterns and alien lights alike. Delegates sat in circles, not thrones, weighing each choice as though it would shape 1,000 years. Decisions moved slow, yet they held like stone once set. And in those chambers, across tongues and species, one refrain echoed above all. Storms fade, rivers endure. It had become the very law of the stars. Back on the forgotten earth, Hollow Creek still whispered through its crooked bed. Moss grew thick, rain still fell, and the water murmur carried words that had seeded galaxies. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim remained to hear it, yet its truth had crossed light years, reborn in rituals of flame and water on worlds far from its soil. Eli Cartwright's name was long gone, his lantern dust, but his fortune had never been a man. It was a current, and now that current spanned the stars. Storms still came, wars, greed, betrayals, but each time they passed, as they always did. The river carried on, wider now than any galaxy, unbroken as the dark itself, whispering steady as ever. Storms fade, rivers endure. As the river's whisper flowed further into the heavens, whole constellations of civilizations began to see themselves not as separate powers, but as tributaries of one endless current. Star systems that once marked their borders in fear now marked them in trust, calling themselves branches of the same stream. The maps of the age no longer bore lines of division, but lines of flow, currents drawn between worlds where patience bound trade, law, and kinship. Folk spoke of the great river, not as metaphor, but as the truest name for their shared existence. Each world was a bend, each people a stream, each lantern lit in storm, a drop in the tide that carried all. These constellations wove together cultures of astonishing diversity, yet all sang the same refrain in their own tongues. On ocean worlds, sailors poured bowls of salt water into the tide before every voyage. On desert planets, caravans carried lanterns into sandstorms, their glow a promise that the storm would pass. In orbital stations, children splashed in domes of recycled rain, laughing as their elders whispered that patience itself was wealth. None of them knew the crooked little creek where the creed had begun, yet each echoed it as if it had always been theirs. The councils of this age grew vast, stretching across light years. Delegates met by beams of light, their voices joining across the dark like droplets in a stream. Decisions were slow, sometimes taking years, yet they held like mountains once passed. Storms of war still rose on occasion, as ambition and pride always will, but they never lasted long. The current of the great river pulled all back into harmony, reminding each people that storms roar only for a season, while rivers carve for eternity. Poets of the constellations found endless metaphors in the creed. They wrote of galaxies as spirals of flow, of stars as lanterns glowing steady, of civilizations as bends in a current too wide to see in one lifetime. Children memorized verses that told them their lives were droplets, precious not for their flash, but for their part in the tide. Farmers, traders, rulers all measured themselves by how faithfully they flowed. To break patience was to fight against the very marrow of the cosmos. And though none remembered his name, Eli Cartwright's fortune pulsed in it all. Hollow Creek murmur had crossed into the marrow of galaxies, unseen yet eternal. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The valley lay forgotten, rain still fallen on mossy banks, the creek still crooked in its bed. No pilgrim remained to kneel there, but the river did not need pilgrims. Its truth was already carved into the stars. Storms still roared, they always would, but the great river endured, steady as ever, patient as time, eternal as breath, and all who lived by it endured with it. The great river swelled until it was spoken of not merely as a guide to life, nor even as the bond of worlds, but as the destiny of the cosmos itself. Civilizations gazing out across the sweep of galaxies began to believe they were being carried together toward a horizon greater than stars. They saw themselves not as rulers of their own ages, but as passengers in a current too vast to fathom, each people a droplet joining the tide. The stories of their children no longer ended with heroes who conquered, but with heroes who endured, whose lanterns glowed steady through the longest nights. They taught that to flow true was not only to survive, but to fulfill the very purpose of existence. Councils of whole star clusters gathered in patient circles, speaking of the flow as though it were a destination. They did not ask what empires to build, but what legacy to leave when the current bent onward. Trade became less about profit and more about continuity. Each ledger a vow that children would inherit plenty. Temples of every kind, though different in stone and song, shared the same ritual. Water poured, lights raised, silence kept. It was no longer prayer to gods nor plea for mercy. It was agreement with the river, a recognition that storms pass, but the current endures. Philosophers of that age wrote of the confluence, saying it was the moment all streams would meet, when every world, every people, every flame of patience would flow into one ocean of being. They debated what that meant. Some claimed it would be the birth of a new cosmos, others that it was simply the recognition that all had always been one. Poets sang of it as a lantern so bright it needed no fuel, a light that outshone storms not by force but by never faltering. And children, sitting cross-legged in classrooms of glass and stone, whispered to one another that they hoped to see the confluence in their lifetimes, even if it took 1,000 years. Back on Earth, the valley of Hollow Creek lay silent, unseen by the countless eyes turned skyward. The crooked creek still ran, rain still fell, and its murmur still whispered, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No one heard, no one remembered, but the soil carried the truth, the water hummed the song, and the air breathed patience into moss and stone. That forgotten valley was the first bend of the great river, though the cosmos itself no longer knew. Eli Cartwright's name had long since dissolved into silence, but the fortune he sparked had become the destiny of creation. A smoke-stained lantern in a rainy square had lit a current that now stretched across galaxies, binding civilizations together in patient trust. Storms still rose, they always would, but they no longer defined the story, the river did. And in that endless flow, the cosmos found its purpose, steady as rain, eternal as rivers. Across the breadth of the stars, whispers of the confluence grew louder, carried in songs, councils, and the quiet prayers of families who lifted lanterns in the dark. Civilizations that had once marked their place by banners or borders now spoke of themselves only as streams bending toward the same ocean. They believed the age of storms was nearly done, that all currents were drawn together to meet the river itself. Children grew up not dreaming of conquest or riches, but of witness in that day, when every flame of patience and every drop of endurance would join in one endless tide. For the first time in history, the destiny of all peoples was not seen as separate, it was seen as shared. Councils of the great river grew vast beyond imaginings, representatives gathering from hundreds of worlds, their voices carried across the void like ripples spreading in a pond. Decisions took decades, sometimes centuries, yet none faltered once made. Lanterns glowed steady in those halls, their flames reflecting in eyes of many shapes, and silence often said more than words. They no longer spoke of survival, for that had been secured by the creed. They spoke instead of legacy, of what patience would mean when the confluence came. Would they dissolve into one? Would they awaken to a truth larger than all? No one knew, but all agreed that to endure was to find out. Culture blossomed under this expectancy. Poets filled the skies with verses etched into satellites that drifted like stars, their words proclaiming that every droplet mattered, every flame belonged. Farmers sowed seed in patterns that mirrored rivers, saying their harvest was a rehearsal for the confluence. Children painted rivers on walls and sang of currents meeting in oceans too wide for sight. Even rulers, often tempted by pride, now bowed to the belief that their duty was not to shine like thunder, but to carry their people like streams to the greater tide. Back on Earth, The crooked creek of Hollow Creek still wound through moss and stone. Its murmur was soft, but in that hush was the same truth the cosmos now awaited. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Rain fell, drops gathering in the soil, the old valley breathing the rhythm of patience. No pilgrim returned, no memory lingered, yet the land still hummed the seed of it all. That forgotten whisper was now the song of galaxies, though none alive knew its source. Eli Cartwright's story was long gone, but his fortune had become prophecy fulfilled. The battered lantern he once raised against the rain had lit a creed that carried beyond ages, beyond stars, beyond memory, until it guided civilizations toward their shared destiny. Storms still flared as they always would, but none could shake the river, and so the streams bent onward, flowing steady toward the confluence they believed waited just ahead, an ocean eternal, where storms would fade and rivers endure forever. The ages rolled forward, and the sense of drawing near grew stronger with every generation. Civilization spoke in hushed tones of being on the very threshold of the confluence, as though eternity itself was gathering just beyond sight. Lanterns were raised higher, burning longer, their glow reflected in the eyes of millions who believed they would soon see the streams join as one. Councils vast beyond reckoning grew quieter than ever, weighing each word with the gravity of knowing they stood at the edge of destiny. The air of the age was heavy, yet not with fear, with anticipation, with reverence, with the calm that comes before a tide that will carry all. Signs of the river pull appeared everywhere. Traders, who once thought of profit, now spoke only of continuity, saying they were not moving goods but guiding droplets to the ocean. Farmers sowed fields in patterns of spiraling currents, dedicating harvests as offerings to the greater flow. Families lit lanterns not just for their kin but for all streams, whispering blessings that stretched across worlds. Poets sang of a horizon unseen but certain, describing it as a light wider than galaxies, a silence deeper than storms, a current where all rivers would find their rest. Even rulers, who had once been tempted by pride, humbled themselves as stewards of streams, their crowns seen not as thunder, but as stones guiding the way. Children grew up dreaming not of what they might achieve alone, but of what they would become together. Their games mimicked rivers joining, their songs told of droplets reunite, their lessons ended not with warnings of storms, but with promises of the ocean. The very marrow of culture shifted, no longer built around survival, nor even prosperity, but around destiny. Folk of every shape and tongue believed they would live to see the confluence, the moment when the river itself revealed its full breadth. And all the while, back on the quiet earth, Hollow Creek still ran its crooked course. Rain fell, moss thickened, roots dug deep, and the creek whispered the same truth it always had. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No ear remained to hear, no pilgrim came to kneel, yet the soil remembered. That murmur, born of one man patience by lantern light, had carried across universes and now pulsed in the bones of civilizations on the verge of eternity. Eli Cartwright's name was dust, his lantern ash, yet his fortune had never been name nor flame. It was this, that a creed of patience could outlast storms, outlast empires, outlast stars, and guide all streams toward the ocean. And now as constellations bent like tributaries toward a single horizon, the fortune was near fulfilled. Storms still flickered at the edges, but none could stop the tide. The river was gathering, the confluence drawing close, and all creation held its breath. And so the streams began to merge. It did not happen with thunder, nor in a blaze of conquest, but in silence as deep as midnight. Civilizations that had once marked distance in light years now felt themselves draw close, their currents intertwining like tributaries meeting at last. Councils, vast and patient, found their voices blend without need for vote. Traders spoke in fewer words, yet understood each other more. Families lit lanterns not for their own homes alone, but for every home, as though all hearths were one. The first touch of the confluence was not seen in the sky, but felt in the marrow, as calm, as clarity, as a knowing that they were no longer many rivers, but one tide. Poets of the age tried to capture it, but their verses faltered, for the moment could not be caged in rhyme. It is like breath itself, one wrote, not the inhale or exhale, but the space between where all is still. Priests declared that the confluence was no promise deferred, but reality already dawning, that every lantern lifted, every drop poured, was proof of its arrival. Children, who had grown up dreaming of it, now lived as though they already swam in the ocean, sharing without thought, speaking with patience that once took years to learn. Their laughter rang across worlds, brighter than thunder, steady as rivers. The stars themselves seemed to echo the change. Patterns once charted as separate constellations now appeared as one flowing stream. Astronomers, gazing through their lenses, wept at the sight, saying the heavens had bent into river shape. Farmers sowed seed in spirals to mimic the stars. Sailors steered by the curves of light, and architects carved rivers into stone floors of councils as sign that destiny had arrived. Everywhere folk felt the hush of being carried, and though they knew it not, the crooked creek of Hollow Creek had always been the first tributary, the first murmur of this tide. Rain still fell there, moss still thickened, the water still whispered, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." The valley was forgotten, its soil trod by no pilgrim, yet in its quiet flow lay the seed of this ocean. Eli Cartwright's name was gone, his lantern ash, yet his fortune had become eternity itself. Storms still flickered at the edges, small, proud, noisy, but they dissolved quick, like foam upon the surface of an endless tide. The river had gathered, the confluence had begun, and creation itself moved as one current, steady, silent, eternal. The confluence deepened until no current could be told apart from another. Civilizations that once stood proud in their difference now flowed seamless, their voices blended into a single harmony that required no translation. Lanterns glowed across worlds and stations, yet none were seen as separate flames, they were facets of the same great light. What had begun as patience in one boy ledger and glow of one battered lamp had become an ocean vast enough to cradle galaxies. The river was no longer guide nor law, but being itself, the marrow of creation revealed at last. In this ocean, storms still rose, but they no longer mattered. Their thunder was muffled, their roar dissolved into the tide before it could break. Greed flared, pride hissed, but each was carried away like foam atop a flood, leaving no scar behind. The people of the confluence did not fight storms nor fear them, they simply endured, their patience deeper than any noise. Children grew without need of lessons, for the rhythm was already theirs. They lived as droplets in the tide, precious not for what they seized, but for how they flowed. Poets tried again to capture the moment, but most laid down their pens, confessing words were too small. It is silence, they said. It is light. It is the space where all storms have passed and all rivers endure. Priests bowed their heads, no longer preaching, for the creed needed no voice when it had become breath itself. Farmers sowed not only for their kin but for the unseen, certain their harvests were offerings to an ocean wider than sight. Traders exchanged not for profit but for flow, their ledgers no longer records of debt but of trust eternal. And though none alive knew it, the crooked creek of Hollow Creek had always been the first note of this song. Rain still fell on its banks, roots still drank from its soil, and the water still whispered, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." The valley was forgotten, but its truth was not. That murmur had grown into the confluence, into the great ocean where all creation now drifted as one. Eli Cartwright's name was gone, his lantern dust, but his fortune had outlived memory, time, and stars. The confluence was not an end but a revelation, that the river had always been, that all droplets had always belonged, that every storm had only carved the path to this vast tide. And in that tide, patience was eternal, trust was unbroken, endurance was forever. The river had become the ocean, and the ocean was the river. The confluence swelled until time itself seemed to dissolve within its embrace. Ages no longer passed as seasons or centuries, for all moments flowed together like droplets indistinguishable in the tide. Civilizations once measured by rise and fall no longer thought of themselves as chapters but as currents, eternal and seamless. Lanterns glowed across countless worlds, yet they were no longer seen as separate fires. They were sparks of the same endless flame, steady as breath, unbroken as the river that had carried them here. In the confluence, patience was not practiced, it was being itself. Storms flickered at the edges as they always had, but their noise mattered less than a whisper in the wind. Pride flared, greed hissed, ambition rattled, but each vanished before it could scar the tide. The people of the confluence no longer feared storms, for they had become ocean vast, calm, eternal. Children were born into its rhythm, laughing as though they had always known the song. Elders passed not into silence but into the current, their patience blending with the tide. No one was lost, all were carried. Poets abandoned words, taken instead to silence and gesture, for no language could cage what they lived. They raised lanterns not as symbols, but as truth itself. The glow was the river was the glow. Priests bowed before still water, speaking only one refrain, storms fade, rivers endure. Farmers sowed seed with reverence, each furrow a line in the river's song. Traders exchanged goods not with calculation but with trust, for in the confluence no debt remained, only flow. And still unseen, the crooked creek of Hollow Creek wound through moss and stone. Rain pattered on its banks, roots pressed into its soil, and the water hummed, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No pilgrim came, no ear listened, but the murmur was no less eternal. That forgotten valley had seeded an ocean that now held galaxies in its embrace. Eli Cartwright's name was long dissolved, his lantern dust, but his fortune had never been coin nor glory. It had been this, that patience, trust, and endurance could outlast memory, time, even stars, until all creation was one tide. The confluence was not end nor beginning, it was revelation. The truth that had always been now lived without question. The river was eternal, the ocean infinite, and within it all storms had finally found their rest. The confluence became not merely the destiny of civilizations, nor even the bond of stars, but the very hum of existence itself. Time no longer carried weight as past or future. Every droplet of patience, every act of trust, every lantern raised against storm was folded into the same eternal flow. Creation no longer moved in cycles of rise and fall, for there was no rise, no fall, only current. The river had revealed its truest self, not a guide, not a creed, not even a law, but the marrow of all being. It did not begin, it did not end. It simply flowed, eternal, unbroken, unhurried. In that endless tide, storms lost all meaning. Their roar was no more than foam dissolving on the surface of an ocean without shore. Pride flared, greed flickered, but neither found foothold in the current. They were noise, and noise cannot endure where all is flow. The people, if people they could still be called, did not resist storms nor fear them. They simply were, as rivers are, as oceans are, as breath is. Patience was not practiced, it was lived. Trust was not chosen, it was essence. Endurance was not effort, it was eternity. Poets had long since set aside words, yet their silence became poetry itself. Priests no longer preached, for there was no need. Every glance, every breath, every glow of lantern or star was sermon enough. Farmers planted not for harvest but as ritual, each seed a droplet returned into the flow. Traders gave and received without reckoning, for there was no debt where all was tied. Even children born into the confluence laughed not in innocence but in knowledge, knowing they had always belonged and always would. And though it mattered to no living soul, the crooked creek of Hollow Creek still wound its way through moss and stone on a forgotten earth. Rain still fell, water still murmured, don't chase storms, dig rivers. No ear heard, no pilgrim knelt, yet the soil remembered. The current hummed, the truth endured. That valley had once birthed a fortune too great for memory to hold, and though its name was lost, its echo was now the heartbeat of creation. Eli Cartwright's lantern had burned out long ago, his story erased, his name dust, yet his fortune had never been in the telling, it had been in the flowing. And now the river flowed as all things, in all things forever. Storms had passed, rivers endured, the confluence was eternity itself. The river hum stretched beyond the cosmos that had once carried stars and storms alike, flowing into a silence deeper than void, wider than any horizon. It was not bound to space nor time, for both had become droplets dissolved in its tide. What remained was rhythm, patient and eternal, the steady pulse that underlay all that had been and all that would ever be. The confluence had passed from story into essence, from creed into marrow, until it was no longer a thing to be spoken or lived, but the very truth of existence itself. And yet within that vast ocean of stillness, renewal lingered like a seed waiting for rain. For the river was never only endurance, it was renewal too. Just as storms once cleared fields for sowing, so too did silence clear the soil of creation. From the hum of the current, sparks stirred, small, faint at first, yet steady. They were not storms nor noise, but the first droplets of a new flow. And so, out of eternity itself, the river began to bend toward another beginning. No pilgrim, no poet, no priest marked the moment. There were no eyes to see it, no tongues to speak it, yet the rhythm carried forward, as it always had. Stars would rise again, worlds would form, rivers would carve valleys, lanterns would be raised in rain, and voices would whisper once more that storms fade, rivers endure. None would remember the first whisper. None would know the name of Eli Cartwright. None would trace their creed to a crooked creek on a forgotten earth, but they would live by it as surely as breath, as surely as rain, as surely as rivers. And still, though no soul remained to hear, Hollow Creek whispered through moss and stone. Rain fell, soil drank, water wound its crooked way. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That murmur, born in patience, carried across eternities, seeding dawns yet unborn. The lantern that once smoked in a boy's hand had lit not just a square in a storm, not just a town, not just a world, but all that ever was and all that ever would be. Storms had roared and fallen silent, empires had risen and turned to dust, stars had blazed and gone cold, yet the river endured, patient as ever, eternal as breath. And from its flow, creation would rise again. From the hush of eternity, the river bent once more, carrying sparks of renewal into a fresh dawn. What began as whispers in the dark swelled into a slow, steady glow, droplets of light gathering like lanterns in rain. Space itself, once emptied, stirred with currents unseen, Patterns form in where silence had reigned. No storm announced it, no thunder split the void. Creation returned as the river always returns, quiet, patient, inevitable. New stars kindled, small flames at first, then constellations wide as oceans, worlds spun from dust, rivers carved their crooked paths again, and life stirred, unremembering, yet guided by the same hum that had carried all before. Civilizations of this newborn cosmos rose in time, their songs and stories fresh, their customs strange. Yet though they knew nothing of ages past, they walked the same path, carried by marrow they did not name. Farmers saved for lean years, traders honored their word above profit, rulers measured greatness not by thunder but by what endured. Children laughed in rain, lifted lanterns against storms, and whispered promises they thought their own invention. But it was the river speaking, as it always had, echoing through them without need of memory. Storms rose, storms roared, storms faded, rivers endured. Philosophers of that dawn age puzzled over the rhythm that guided them. Why do we trust patience, they asked. Why do we believe in endurance? They had no history to point to, no creed to recite, yet they felt its truth in their bones. Priests said it was the breath of creation. Scientists called it law. Poets named it song. But all agreed it was eternal. And though none spoke the words exactly as Eli Cartwright once had, all lived their meaning. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Back on the valley of Hollow Creek, though earth itself had long since passed into silence, the shape of its soil and stone lingered in echo, woven into the fabric of the new. The first bend of the river, the first whisper of its truth, was folded unseen into every dawn, every flame, every flow. Eli Lantern was gone, his name dust beyond dust, yet his fortune lived eternal in each beginning. And so creation began anew, carried by the same current, whispering the same refrain, endless as breath. Storms fade, rivers endure. The river flowed on. In the new dawn, as rivers cut their paths through valleys and stars spun steady in their courses, the hum of the river shaped cultures as naturally as breath. Villages grew along water edge, folk gathering where flow was strongest, and from their first markets came the same instinct, patience before profit, trust before haste. Ledgers filled with careful tallies, farmers stored grain beyond the season, and merchants honored promises though storms tempted them otherwise. Without memory of the past, they still carried its marrow, living by a creed they never named yet always knew. Songs rose in those early halls and hearths, verses sung of rivers that never ceased, of storms that broke but could not last. Children laughed as they splashed in streams, mothers and fathers teaching them to save, to wait, to endure. Lanterns glowed again in the rain, not copied from old ritual, but born anew as if flame itself remembered what men had forgotten. Families spoke sayings that echoed across time. Hold steady, trust the current, rivers before storms. None knew they were ancient words reborn, yet each tongue carried them with ease, for patience had always been the truest inheritance. In time, rulers rose and fell, as rulers always will. Some chased storms, loud, boastful, promising greatness overnight. Their reigns were short, their names cursed, their empires crumble quick as thunder fades. Others built steady, listening longer than they spoke, tending their people like soil. Their reigns endured, their names etched into memory, their laws carved like rivers through stone. Poets told of them not as heroes who conquered, but as keepers of flow, guardians who knew storms would come but rivers would carry on. And back in the hidden echo of Hollow Creek, though no pilgrim had ever heard its name, the murmur of water still whispered beneath moss and rain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. That valley voice had folded itself into creation's song, humming through the veins of this cosmos as it had through all before. Eli Cartwright Lantern was gone, his story erased by silence, yet his fortune endured, reborn in each dawn, remembered not by name but by rhythm. Storms roared, storms passed, rivers endured, and civilizations, new and strange, flourished again by that eternal truth, living proof that patience alone was wealth eternal, the only fortune no storm could erase. As the renewed civilizations deepened their roots, they began to weave the river hum into law and legend alike. Councils gathered in great halls built beside waterways, their chambers lit by rows of steady flames. Decisions were not hurried but weighed with patience. Each voice added like a stone to the riverbed until the current of consensus was clear. Justice was measured not by swiftness, but by endurance. Punishments designed not to crush, but to correct, to guide the flow back into its course. The lantern became the symbol of truth itself, scarred yet steady, its glow a reminder that storms pass but patience abides. Legends too grew from the rhythm. Bards sang of rivers that carved mountains, of kings who ruled by waiting, of wanderers who found treasure not by chasing storms but by sitting still until the current brought it to them. Children memorized fables of droplets join in to make mighty floods, their laughter carrying the creed forward in games and rhymes. Farmers planted with ritual, pouring water into furrows before seed, whispering that the soil would remember. Merchants lit lamps over their scales, swearing their honesty by the glow. The creed was not quoted, it was lived, stitched into the marrow of every task. Even in times of trial, when flood struck or famine threatened, folk turned not to panic but to patience. They stored, they trusted, they endured, and when the storm passed, as it always did, they rebuilt with quiet strength. Songs of renewal filled the air, not of conquest or revenge, but of gratitude for rivers that carried them through. Rulers who had sought storms of glory were forgotten quick, but those who kept steady were remembered in statues and stone. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek echo still hummed, unseen and unheard. Its crooked waters wound through moss, whispering the same refrain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Though no pilgrim knew its name, its truth had crossed ages into this reborn world, carrying the fortune of a boy who once bent over a smoke-stained lantern. Eli Cartwright's story was dust, yet his fortune breathed eternal, shaping laws, legends, and lives of people who never knew him. Storms still rose, as storms must, but the people no longer feared them, for they had learned again the only lesson worth keeping. Storms fade, rivers endure, and in that endurance, cultures flourished, rich not in gold or conquest, but in patience itself, the crown of all achievement. In time, the steady strength of the River Creed gave rise to vast alliances folk began to call the river realms. They were not forged by conquest, nor held by chains, but by currents of trust that stretched across mountains, seas, and skies. Each realm was a branch of the greater flow, tied to others not by armies, but by promises, by lanterns raised in storms, by ledgers written honest and true. Where empires of old had roared and collapsed, these realms bent like streams, curving and twisting but never breaking. Their power lay not in thunder but in patience, not in fire but in endurance. Trade among the realms flowed like lifeblood. Merchants carried goods across borders without fear, for a man's word, once proven steady, was stronger than steel. Coins bore the emblem of rivers, not kings, and their value was measured in trust more than in weight. Councils joined across the realms, sitting in circles where no throne stood higher than another. Their debates stretched long, yet their decisions endured for centuries, unshaken by storms of pride or ambition. Lanterns burned in those halls, glowing scarred but steady, a reminder that law itself was patient light against the dark. Culture flourished under this harmony. Poets filled the air with songs of streams meeting in wide oceans, their verses carrying from taverns to temples. Farmers sowed festivals of gratitude, pouring water on their fields as a vow to endure another year. Sailors named their ships after rivers, trusting the current to guide them more than wind or star. Even rulers spoke humbly of themselves as stewards of flow, their reigns judged not by battles won but by how steady their people endured. Children grew up hearing fables of storms defeated not by swords but by waiting, of rivers carving mountains not in a day but across ages. Yet through all their greatness they never knew the crooked creek where it began. Hollow Creek still wound its way through moss and stone, whispering as it always had, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No pilgrim stood on its banks, no poet traced its song, yet its murmur had grown into the anthem of realms wide as continents. Eli Cartwright's lantern was long gone, but the glow he sparked now lit millions of homes, steady as rain, eternal as patience. Storms came as they must. Greed rose, pride rattled, ambition burned, yet none lasted, for the river realms had bound themselves to endurance, and so they flowed together, strong not in thunder but in trust, eternal as the current that carried them all. From the strength of the river realms, the people at last turned their eyes outward again, not with hunger for conquest, but with lanterns lifted to guide their way. They built vessels patient and sure, ships crafted not for speed alone, but for endurance. Each plank, each beam, each rivet a vow to last through storm. When they crossed their skies and reached beyond, they carried with them the creed as naturally as breath. Storms roar, rivers endure. Colonies planted on distant moons and barren stones thrived only when they lived by that truth. ration and careful, build and steady, trust and slow. Outposts that sought quick wealth or bright glory fell silent, their light swallowed by the dark. Word spread across the stars that survival belonged not to the boldest nor to the proudest, but to those who flowed like rivers. Trade across the heavens took the same shape. Ships moved in steady lanes folk came to call currents. Each merchant name valued more for honesty than for the weight of his hold. Riverborn became the badge of trust, spoken in many tongues yet meaning the same. This one endures. This one can be believed. Councils of colonies lit lanterns before speaking, their glow carrying memory of countless generations who had sat in rain and promised the same patience. Decisions were slow, yet they held like mountains unshaken even by the silence of space. Culture, too, blossomed under alien suns. Lantern festivals filled domes and stations, their glow shimmering against void black skies. Children splashed in recycled rain, laughing as elders whispered the same creed their ancestors had never forgotten, though they'd never known its source. Poets wrote of rivers among the stars, describing galaxies themselves as bends in the current. Priests poured water on stone altars, proclaiming in strange accents the truth older than worlds. Storms fade, rivers endure. Back on the forgotten earth, hollow creeks still whispered through moss and stone. Rain fell, soil drank, and the water hummed. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim remained, no name was remembered, but its murmur had crossed into the marrow of a cosmos reborn. Eli Cartwright's lantern was long gone, yet its glow now shone in countless stars, carried in the marrow of folk who had never known his name yet lived by his fortune. Storms still flared, wars, greed, betrayals, but none endured. The river carried on, flowing through ships and worlds, steady as breath, eternal as patience. And in that flow, humankind and all its kin endured with it, lanterns lifted against the dark. The fortune that waited in the rain. The night had that heavy stillness that comes before a storm, the kind where every cricket goes quiet and the trees lean in as if they're listening. A fire cracked low in the ring of stones, lantern light flickering across weathered boots and a worn notebook open on the log beside me. Folks had asked more than once why I tell stories the way I do, slow and deliberate, like I'm drawing water from a deep well instead of pouring from a jug. Truth is, some tales ain't meant to be rushed. They're meant to settle in a man's bones like coals in a hearth, burning steady long after the flames are gone. This here the story of a man most never knew, whose fortune wasn't gold nor cattle, nor any of the things that set tongues wagging in saloons. His fortune was patience, hard-earned, thankless patience, and it grew into something wider than the hills, deeper than rivers, longer lasting than memory itself. He was a boy first, no different than you or me, scrawny as a fence rail and just as bent from chores. His family wasn't poor, not exactly, but they knew lean winters where supper was beans stretched thin and summers where the soil cracked wide and begged for rain. That boy, name of Jonah, learned early that storms come and storms go, but what a man builds steady will outlast them both. Now Jonah didn't have the swagger of a gambler nor the silver tongue of a politician. He wasn't the kind to ride into town with spurs jingling or a pocket full of gold. What he did have was a lantern, a stub of pencil, and an old ledger he found in a pile of junk. He took to writing down every coin that passed through his hands, wages from fencing fields, pennies from mending tools, nickels from selling eggs. Seemed foolish to folks watching, a boy hunched over scraps when he could have been out running wild. But Jonah had that patient look in his eyes, like he wasn't tallying numbers so much as carving a path. One autumn, when the rains came harder than the roof could hold, he set his lantern on the table and tallied up what he'd saved. It weren't much, just a few dollars, wrinkled and worn, but it was more than he'd ever had at once. Most boys would have spent it quick, sweets, trinkets, maybe a gamble or two at the fair. Not Jonah. He tucked it away, whispering words only the rain could hear. Storms fade, rivers endure. That became his creed. Year by year, job by job, he kept scratching figures in his ledger, never boasting, never showing off. He bought tools before he bought whiskey, seed before he bought boots, land before he thought of luxury. When storms came, and they always did, he had enough to last. Neighbors took note. Some scoffed, calling him miser. Others borrowed from him when their pockets ran dry, finding his patience had turned to strength. Jonah never charged interest, never gloated, just said the same words each time. Rivers carved slow, but they carved deep. In time, his savings grew into fields, his fields into harvests, his harvest into wagons of grain that fed whole towns through lean winters. Folks began to see that his fortune wasn't just his own, it was theirs too, carried by the patience of one man who refused to chase storms. But Jonah's story didn't end with his own belly full or his own land secure. See, the true measure of fortune ain't what a man holds in his hand, but what flows through him to others. And Jonah, sitting by his fire with that old ledger and lantern glowing, came to understand that. He built schools where children could learn letters instead of hunger. He laid aside funds to mend roads so neighbors could trade easier. He gave quiet loans, not to profit but to steady others through their storms. All of it came from patience, from the slow river he'd tended since boyhood. Now, folk might have forgotten his name over the years. Stories tend to twist, and heroes with louder tales drown out the quiet ones. But the truth of Jonah's fortune never faded. The fields he sowed, the schools he built, the roads he mended, they outlasted him, just like he said they would. And when folks gathered round their own fires, hearing the rain patter steady on the roof, they'd whisper words their grandfathers swore by. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. So when you hear the wind pick up and the thunder rumble, remember this fortune ain't found in noise, it found in patience. It carves slow, like a river through stone, steady as breath, sure as the dawn. And maybe if you tend your river well, your fortune will flow farther than you'll ever see. The years pressed on Jonah like the weight of mountains, but he bore them the way a river bears stone, slow, patient, unbroken. Seasons rolled across his land, each one a test of what he'd stored and what he'd sown. Some years were generous, rain falling soft, soil given more than it was asked. Other years were cruel, drought cracking fields, storms tearing fences, locusts darkening the sky till noon looked like dusk. Where others cursed and folded, Jonah endured. He'd set aside grain when harvests were plenty, coin when markets were kind, patience when tempers flared. And in each lean year, he had enough to steady his household and a little more to spare for neighbors who hadn't yet learned the rhythm of the river. There was one winter remembered clear across the county when snow fell thicker than folk had seen in a generation. Roads vanished, wagons froze in place, families huddled round fires burning their last scraps of wood. Many thought it was the end of all they'd built, a storm too fierce to outlast. But Jonah, lantern glowing against frostbit windows, opened his barns and granaries. He handed out sacks of grain, logs of firewood, and when neighbors asked what he wanted in return, he just smiled that tired smile of his. Keep your word when the sun shines, he'd say, that all the river asks. It wasn't charity, not the way some saw it. It was trust, as steady as the flow he'd tended all his life. And those families, warmed and fed by his patience, never forgot. When the thaw came, they brought back double what he'd given, not out of obligation but out of honor. His fortune, quiet and unassuming, had spread wider than his own land. It had carved into the marrow of the community, binding them together through storms they never could have weathered alone. But fortune has a way of drawing envy too. There were men who looked at Jonah fields and thought only of taking. Fast-talking traders came riding in with schemes painted bright, promising to triple his wealth if only he'd risk what he had. Jonah listened, patient as always, then shook his head. Storms roar loud, he told them, but it's the river that feeds the valley. They rode off cussing, calling him a fool, yet one by one their ventures collapsed, leaving nothing but debts and broken wagons behind. Jonah stayed steady, his ledger scratched with slow numbers that never dazzled but never failed. There was even a banker from the city, slick shoes sinking in the mud as he came to Jonah's porch. He waved papers thick with promises, charts and figures that spoke of fortunes quick as lightning. Jonah listened, nodded, then closed the man folder gentle-like. You chase storms, he said. I dig rivers. The banker left angry, muttering about lost chances, but years later when his bank folded, folks remembered Jonah's words and shook their heads in wonder. Through it all, Jonah never once let pride set root. When people came thanking him for saving their families, he'd wave them off. Don't thank me, he'd say, pointing to the rain streaking his window. Thank the river. He knew his fortune wasn't his alone, it was the current flowing through him, steady and eternal. He was just the keeper, the hand tending the flow. By the time his hair silvered and his back bent, Jonah's field stretched far, his barns stood full, his roads carried wagons heavy with trade. But if you asked him what his greatest wealth was, he wouldn't point to land or coin. He'd point to the lantern sitting on his table, smoke-stained and scarred, still burning steady against the night. That flame, he believed, was proof enough. Storms fade, rivers endure. And when children gathered round his porch on stormy nights, eyes wide, he'd tell them stories not of gold or glory, but of patience. He'd show them his old ledger, pages worn thin, numbers scratchy and plain. This is how rivers are dug, he'd say, not with shovels nor dynamite, but with patience, day after day, year after year. And those children, watching the glow of the lantern and hearing the murmur of rain, carried the lesson home like treasure. Jonah's fortune was never loud, never quick, never boastful, but it was steady and it was sure. And in the end, that's the only kind of fortune that lasts. Word of Jonah Way drifted further than the bend of his creek or the fence lines of his fields. Travelers carry stories the way rivers carry silt, and soon enough his name was spoken in towns he'd never seen. Folks didn't talk about him like some grand baron or cattle king. They told of a man who kept his promises when storms raged, who lent without demanding, who stored grain till it saved lives. To some that sounded like myth, to others it was hope. They called him the man who dug rivers, though he never lifted more than a shovel to mend his ditches. Merchants came riding through, asking for his counsel on how to keep their ledgers from running red. Jonah would sit with them by lantern light, running a weathered finger down their pages. He never told them where to buy or when to sell. He told them how to wait, how to save, how to endure. A storm will always tempt you, he'd say, voice slow as the creek behind his house. It shines, it dazzles, it roars, but it passes quick, leaving nothing but broken branches. The river, though, it don't dazzle, don't roar, it carves, and in time it makes valleys of plenty. Some took his words to heart. They built businesses that stood firm through market crashes, their names tied to steady supply instead of flashy risk. Others scoffed, riding back to town and investing in schemes that promised riches overnight. Those names faded quick, like thunder rolling out of earshot. Jonah never gloated when he heard of their ruin. He just scratched another line in his ledger and kept digging his river. There came a day when a young widow, burdened with debts left by her husband chase after quick fortunes, knocked on Jonah's door. She expected a hard man demanding payment, but instead he poured her tea and listened. When she asked for more time, he nodded. "Storm took your roof," he said, "but you still got soil, plant steady, and the river will feed you yet." He gave her seed grain instead of coin, patience instead of punishment. Years later, her farm stood tall again, her children healthy, and she swore Jonah's kindness had saved more than her land. It had saved her will to endure. Stories like that grew until they reached city ears. Bankers and officials traveled dusty roads to meet this quiet man. They expected a schemer or genius, but they found an old farmer in boots caked with mud, a lantern smoking on his table, and ledgers filled with figures neat but plain. He had no secret but patience, no trick but trust. And though some left disappointed, others left changed, carrying his creed back to offices where decisions shaped thousands of lives. Jonah never thought of himself as teacher, much less prophet. He still rose with the sun, still fixed fences, still scratched in his ledger, but the flow he tended had become a tide carrying others along. His fortune was no longer just his, it was seeping into the bones of a generation. Fathers told their sons to dig rivers, not chase storms. Mothers taught their daughters to keep ledgers steady, to let patience carve where pride could not. Whole towns began keeping lanterns burning during winter storms, not as light alone but as symbol, steady flame endures. And still, Jonah's own life stayed simple. He patched his coat instead of buying new, mended his boots till the leather near gave out, ate meals plain but hearty. Neighbors whispered he could have lived in splendor, but Jonah would smile, shaking his head. "I'm already rich," he'd say, gesturing to the creek, the fields, the laughter of children in the distance. What more could I ask than to see the river flow? By the time his bones began to ache and his hair turned silver white, Jonah had carved a fortune not measured in coin but in trust. Roads were better because of him, granaries fuller, families stronger. His patience had carved deeper than his own life, and his story had become part of the land itself. And though storms still came, they came softer to those who lived by his way. For they knew, as surely as the river knew its bed, that storms fade, rivers endure. The farther Jonah's story traveled, the less it sounded like a tale about a man, and the more it sounded like a lesson carved into the marrow of living. Towns he had never stepped foot in began to keep ledgers the way he had, families tallying every coin with patience instead of chasing after glimmer. Merchants in bustling markets lifted lanterns above their stalls not just to light the goods, but to mark their promise. Fair scales, steady prices, no deceit. Farmers spoke his words to their children as if they'd been written in scripture. Storms roar, rivers endure. City folk, used to the quick turn of fashion and fortune, were the hardest to convince. They wanted lightning-fast profits, sudden gains, dazzling ventures. Yet each time a crash came, each time a storm tore through their wealth, they looked for steadier ground. And when whispers of Jonah reached them, when they heard of his barns that never emptied, of neighbors he had steadied through storms, they began to listen. Banks rewrote their codes, swearing not to chase every flash of profit, but to build reserves like rivers digging deep. Schools taught children to track their pennies with patience, to write their own ledgers not as chores but as maps to endurance. Jonah himself never saw most of it. he stayed close to his creek, mending his fences, tending his soil, scribbling neat rows in the same old ledger by the same lantern light. But travelers would ride to his porch, sit with him while rain drummed on the roof, and carry his words back to places he could only imagine. They described him as soft-spoken, a man who never raised his voice yet somehow spoke louder than thunder. They said his fortune was carved not in acres or gold, but in trust that spread further than any storm could reach. One spring, a delegation from the city arrived, officials in polished boots, stiff collars, and faces lined with worry. Their markets had collapsed after a frenzy of reckless ventures, leaving widows and children hungry. They asked Jonah to come advise them, to teach them how to rebuild. He declined the travel, saying his river flowed here and not there. But he opened his home, set his lantern between them, and walked them through his old ledger. He pointed to the pages where he'd saved small when others spent big, where he'd endured when others panicked. Fortune, he told them, isn't in the noise, it's in the patience to wait for the storm to pass, in the courage to dig your river even when rain don't fall. They returned to their city changed, and though they never gave him credit, their reforms carried his mark. Reserves grew, families steadied, markets recovered. Jonah Way was no longer rumor, it was blueprint. As the years slipped further, legends grew around him. Some painted him larger than life, claiming he could predict storms or call rain with his patience. Jonah would have chuckled at that, shaken his head. He wasn't prophet nor magician, just a man who chose steady over loud, rivers over storms. But stories have a way of stretching, and by the time he was too old to walk far from his porch, folk were speaking his name with reverence. Yet Jonah himself never sought that reverence. Each night he'd trim the wick of his battered lantern, open his ledger, and tally the day accounts. He lived simple, and he left the world richer not in coin but in endurance. His fortune had flowed beyond his own valley, into towns and cities, into the marrow of generations. And still, when storms rattled the windows, he'd whisper to the fire, same as when he was a boy. Storms fade, rivers endure. When Jonah Bones grew brittle and his steps slowed to a shuffle, folks wondered what would happen when his lantern finally burned low. They feared his way might fade with him, swallowed by the noise of men who still chase storms. But patience, once planted, takes root deeper than pride. Long before Jonah laid down his tools for the last time, his neighbors had already learned to tend their own rivers. They taught their children to keep ledgers, to set aside in seasons of plenty, to lend without greed. This story had become less about the man and more about the creed, passed along in whispers by firelight, in ledgers opened at kitchen tables, in lanterns kept steady against the dark. When Jonah passed, there was no parade, no thunder of speeches. The town gathered in silence, each family bringing a lantern to his porch. They set them down one by one until the whole place glowed like a river of fire running through the night. No one wept loud, they just bowed their heads, hearing the rain on the roof and the creek murmur through the valley. That was his funeral, steady, humble, enduring, just like the man. By dawn, they carried his body to the soil he had tilled, laying him down gentle as a seed. His lantern they left burning in the window, smoke curling into the morning air. But death didn't dim his fortune. If anything, it grew brighter once folk realized it was theirs to carry. Farmers who'd once leaned on Jonah barns now kept their own stores ready. Merchants who'd borrowed grain in winters past now lent to others in turn. Even in the city, far beyond his fields, men quoted his words in council chambers, sometimes without knowing who first spoke them. Storms fade, rivers endure, they'd mutter when debates ran long. And though his name wasn't always remembered, his creed flowed steady as ever. Generations passed, children grew into parents, parents into elders, and still they told the tale of the farmer with the smoke-stained lantern. Some called him Jonah, others gave him different names, but the heart of the story stayed true. A man who dug rivers instead of chasing storms, and by patience alone built a fortune that fed not only himself but all who came near. The fields he sowed changed hands, the barns weathered, the ledger yellowed with age, yet the rhythm he carved in life kept flowing through time. There were lean years still, storms that howled, markets that faltered, but each time folk found their footing again. They'd open their ledgers, light their lanterns, store what they could, and trust the river to carry them. And each time the storm faded, as it always did, they'd nod to one another and whisper the words they'd all been raised on. The creed had outlived the man, just as he'd always known it would. So it was that Jonah fortune, quiet as rain on the roof, became the wealth of whole generations. It was never written in law, never carved in stone, but it endured in the marrow of living. A man name may vanish, but his river, if he patient enough to dig it true, will carve valleys long after he gone. Jonah's lantern had gone dark, yet its glow had become eternal, flickering in every light raised against the storm. It wasn't long before Jonah's name blurred into the fabric of time, yet the rhythm he left behind kept pushing outward like ripples from a stone cast in a pond. Neighboring towns, hearing of the way his folk had weathered storms with full barns and steady hearts, began to ask questions. They sent riders, merchants, and preachers, hoping to catch whatever secret had kept that valley from falling when others broke. What they found wasn't secret at all. It was patience, tallied plain in ledgers and burning steady in lanterns left on porches. They saw families that lent without fear of loss, merchants that weighed fair even when no one was watching, farmers who saved a sack of seed when the harvest was lean. Slowly the lesson seeped outward, not by decree, not by sword, but by example. The city markets, once driven wild by speculation, grew calmer when men adopted the creed. They stopped throwing fortunes after storms, instead laying aside for seasons yet to come. Traders began to keep a portion back, even in their richest months, speaking Jonah words as if they'd always been theirs. Storms fade, rivers endure. Guilds sprang up, not of gamblers but of steady men and women who vowed to honor patience above pride. Their symbols weren't thunderbolts or crowns, they were lanterns, scarred but steady, carried into storm. It reached even into law. Councils passed statutes encouraging reserves, not as punishment but as protection. Towns built communal storehouses so no winter would starve them again. Contracts bore the phrase "as steady as the river," words that bound men to patience instead of haste. And in time, these customs turned to culture. Lantern festivals marked the turn of each season, lights stretching like rivers down streets and across hillsides. Children grew up splashing in creeks, laughing as elders whispered that water itself was teacher enough. Yet through all the growth, the story changed. Jonah's name faded, his fields forgotten, his ledger yellowed to dust. Some said the river creed came from a wise counselor, others from a nameless farmer, others still from the soil itself. It didn't matter. The truth had never been about the man, it had been about the patience he carried. Fortune is never owned, it is tended, like a riverbed, to guide what flows through it, and the flow had grown wide now, deep enough to nourish towns and cities alike. When new storms came, as storms always will, the regions that had learned his way stood firm. Markets dipped, harvests failed, wars rattled their borders, but each time they endured. They rationed, they trusted, they rebuilt. Neighbors helped neighbors, not because of charity, but because it was marrow deep, carved into them by generations living Jonah Creed. And when the storm passed, as it always did, they rose again, stronger than before, their lanterns glowing brighter for the test. So the fortune of one quiet man, scribbled first in a boy-battered ledger, grew into the wealth of entire regions. Not gold, not cattle, not jewels, just patience, trust, endurance. It was enough to outlast any storm, enough to build futures steady as the flow itself. Generations rolled on, and what began as one man's quiet way became the backbone of whole cultures. Children no longer learned Jonah's story by name, yet they grew up with his creed stitched into their lives as naturally as breath. Mothers taught daughters to keep a portion back, no matter how full the cupboard. Fathers told sons to mend tools twice before buying new, and neighbors repeated the words as sure as any prayer. Storms fade, rivers endure. What once had been a lesson whispered on a porch had become a rhythm carrying entire peoples forward. In towns that blossomed along riverbanks, lanterns were raised each year in a festival of light. Streets glowed golden as families placed lamps in windows and on bridges, a living river of fire moving through the night. They didn't always remember why they did it. Some said it was to honor ancestors, others claimed it was to ward off storms, but the truth of it was the same: patience endures. Children ran between the lights, laughing, while elders told stories of rivers outlasting mountains, of patience outlasting thunder. The creed had become celebration. Markets followed the same rhythm. Where once men gambled fortunes on schemes bright as lightning, they now spoke of patience like coin itself. Merchants prided themselves not on how quick they could profit, but on how long their names could be trusted. Ledgers became heirlooms, passed from parent to child, not just as accounts, but as testaments to endurance. A man's honor wasn't measured by his boldest bargain, but by his steadiest line, his ability to wait through the storm without faltering. And in that patience, whole economies found strength no storm could sweep away. The creed even bent the shape of governments. Councils ruled slower, weighing each decision as though it would last a century. Laws bore the mark of patience, contracts written to endure generations, roads built not for glory, but for longevity, schools founded to prepare not just the next year, but the next 50. Rulers who forgot this rhythm, who chased storms of conquest or pride, soon found themselves toppled, not by rebellion alone, but by the simple truth that no storm lasts. Their noise faded, and the patient hands of their people rebuilt in silence, stronger than before. Meanwhile, out in the quiet valley where Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way, the soil carried on humming the truth. Rain fell on moss, roots drank, and the water whispered as it always had: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim stood to hear it, no record was kept, but the murmur carried across time like a current too deep to measure. Jonah's name was gone, his lantern dust, yet his fortune had not dimmed. It had become the marrow of nations, the pulse of cultures, the heartbeat of endurance itself. And though storms still rose, loud as ever, they passed as they always had. What remained were the rivers, the lanterns, the ledgers, the patience steady as stone. And through that patience, whole civilizations flourished, rich not in flash but in endurance, rich not in conquest but in the quiet wealth of surviving every storm. As centuries turned, the creed ceased to be seen as mere habit or tradition. It became law, not written on scrolls or carved into stone, but etched into the marrow of existence itself. Folk no longer asked whether patience was the right path, they accepted it as they accepted sunrise and rain. The river rhythm was the rhythm of life, and to live against it was folly. Children grew up not questioning its truth, but embracing it as natural as drawing breath. Storms might roar, but they were expected to fade. Rivers might carve slow, but they were known to endure. In every city, lanterns glowed eternal. They burned in markets, in homes, in council chambers, and on ships sailing the seas. Their steady flames reminded all that wealth was not in what dazzled, but in what endured. Ledgers grew not just into records of trade, but into sacred trusts, books that families preserved across generations. A father might pass his ledger to his child with the same reverence others reserved for holy relics. To keep the lines steady, to record each gain and loss honest, was a covenant with the river itself. Governments drew strength from the creed as well. Councils debated slower, but their decisions, once passed, held like mountains. Roads stretched across nations, built broad and strong to last centuries. Granaries stood tall, their walls thick as fortresses, not to guard treasure, but to guard the simple wealth of grain through winter's lean. Even armies, when they marched, were taught that victory was not won in flashes of thunder, but in the endurance of supply, patience of strategy, and the quiet trust of comrades standing shoulder to shoulder. Poets wove the river into their verses, speaking of time itself as a current that bends mountains and carries generations. Priests preached less of fire and judgment, more of water and endurance. Farmers poured the first pitcher of rainwater back into the soil each spring, blessing their fields with the creed that had outlasted all storms. In every culture, in every tongue, the same refrain returned like echo. Storms fade, rivers endure. And still, somewhere forgotten by all, Hollow Creek wound its way through moss and stone. Rain fell on its banks, roots pressed deep, the water humming words that no ear heard: don't chase storms, dig rivers. The soil remembered, even when people did not. Jonah's name was long gone, his lantern dust scattered in time, but the fortune he carved had become the very marrow of creation order. Storms still rose, loud and violent. Pride still tempted rulers, greed still lured merchants, and thunder still rattled the earth. But no storm, no matter how fierce, ever lasted. Each faded into silence while the rivers carried on. That truth had become law itself, and through it, civilizations flourished unbroken. Over time, towns and cities that had once stood apart found themselves drawing together, bound not by conquest nor by fear, but by the shared rhythm of the river. They called themselves river nations, though no single stream stretched their full breadth. What united them wasn't geography but creed. Treaties weren't hammered out in haste or sealed with threats. They were spoken slow, lanterns burning steady at the center of the council table. Each word weighed like stone in a riverbed. These nations knew storms would come, but together they swore to endure, to keep the flow unbroken across their borders. Trade among them was less barter and more covenant. Merchants carried not only goods but trust, their names vouched for by families that had honored ledgers for generations. Ships sailed along coastlines lit by lanterns, each harbor signaling safe passage to all who came with honest scales. Currencies bore the emblem of a river cutting through stone, a reminder that wealth lay not in speed but in endurance. And when famine struck one land, the others sent grain without delay, knowing that a storm faced alone could break a nation, but a storm faced together was nothing but noise. Culture bloomed wider than ever before. Festivals of patience spread from one nation to another, entire valleys glittering with lights floating down rivers like stars come to earth. Poets wrote verses of tributaries joining, each voice different, but all singing the same refrain. Storms fade, rivers endure. Children in one land could recite sayings born in another, proof that the creed had become a tongue older and stronger than borders. Even rulers humbled themselves before it, their reigns measured not by battles won, but by how steady they kept their people flowing. Storms still came, and some leaders still tried to chase them. Loud promises of quick glory, schemes of greed painted bright as lightning. But none lasted. Each time a nation strayed, its neighbors steadied it, guiding it back into the flow. And when the storm passed, as it always did, the river nations stood stronger for it, more bound than before. Their patience had become armor, their trust a fortress no thunder could breach. And far away, unseen, Hollow Creek still wound through moss and stone. Rain still fell, Water still whispered, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No pilgrim stood to hear, yet its murmur had become anthem to nations wide as continents. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but the fortune he tended now stretched across entire peoples, binding them together in patience as eternal as the flow itself. The river nations, steady in their bond, soon turned their eyes beyond their own shores, not with hunger for conquest, nor the thunder of armies, but with lanterns lifted high to guide their way. Ships built broad and strong set out across oceans, their sails marked not by crowns or empires, but by the emblem of flowing water. Where they landed, whether in foreign ports or on islands scarcely touched by trade, they carried not threats but trust. They offered grain in famine, tools in hardship, and in return asked only for honesty, for patience, for a seat at the fire where agreements could be spoken slow. In time, their creed began to take root in lands far from their rivers. Foreign merchants, once skeptical of such quiet dealings, found themselves drawn to the reliability of riverborne trade. They saw contracts honored without armies, debts repaid without blood, and slowly they bent their ways to match. Lanterns began to glow in harbors that had never known them before, signals not of ownership but of welcome. A lantern in the storm seemed to mean the same thing across seas. You are safe here, you are trusted here, you will endure here. Even rulers of distant realms, proud and loud as thunder, found themselves humbled when storm after storm stripped them bare while their riverborne neighbors stood steady. Some resisted, mocking the patience as weakness, but their empires cracked like dry riverbeds. Others listened, slow at first, then eager, adopting the creed into their councils. Laws abroad began to echo laws at home. Store in times of plenty, endure in times of want, honor your word as you would your own blood. What had begun as the quiet practice of one valley now stretched across oceans, its truth seeping into every shore it touched. Culture followed the tide. Festivals of lanterns drifted down rivers in lands Jonah had never seen. Children singing songs of patience in tongues far from his own. Markets once filled with haggling and deceit now held stalls where fairness was badge of pride. Travelers spoke of a world slowing from the frenzy of storms into the rhythm of rivers. They said the earth itself seemed steadier, as if the creed had carved not just into men but into the marrow of creation. Yet storms still rose. Greed flared, pride rattled, ambition hissed. A few leaders still tried to chase lightning, promising glory fast and loud, but their noise never lasted. Each storm burned itself out, leaving rivers to flow unbroken. The nations bound by patience simply endured, and endurance proved the truest power of all. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek crooked waters still hummed beneath moss and rain. Forgotten, unseen, it whispered as steady as ever, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Its voice was faint, but it didn't need ears anymore. Its truth had been carried across seas, across nations, across the whole wide world. Jonah Lantern was long gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune had become the flow of nations, patient as rain, eternal as the tide. Continents that had once been carved by borders and scarred by endless strife began to soften under the patience of the river creed. Nations that had stood at odds for centuries found themselves drawn together, not by treaties written in fear, but by the quiet pull of endurance. Councils grew vast, halls filled with delegates from lands wide as horizons, each lantern burning steady in its place. Their debates stretched long, sometimes taking months, even years, but the outcomes were sturdy as mountains. No law passed in haste, no promise made without weight. It was patience, woven into governance itself, that held them. Trade became the arteries of these continents. Caravans crossed deserts, fleets braved oceans, and all of it moved not with the roar of conquest but with the hum of trust. Ledgers linked families across thousands of miles, names etched side by side in neat columns that told not of debt but of covenant. Coins carried the emblem of flowing water, and contracts ended with the refrain spoken in many tongues yet the same in meaning. Storms fade, rivers endure. And endure they did. Culture blossomed in ways no storm-chasing empire had ever known. Cities lit entire rivers with lanterns on festival nights, flames drifting downstream like constellations set free. Poets wrote verses of valleys carved not by kings but by patience. Children played games where the winner wasn't the fastest but the one who could hold steady longest, laughing as they imitated rivers bending round obstacles. Even songs of soldiers shifted. They no longer glorified thunder and charge, but sang of standing firm, of enduring together until the storm passed. Yet storms still tested them. Greed rose in pockets. Leaders sometimes forgot, merchants sometimes strayed, but each time the current of patience pulled them back. Councils reminded their people that no storm, no matter how loud, ever lasts. And in time, the noise faded, leaving the rivers flowing stronger than before. Where once continents had been fractured, they now stood as one harmony, slow but sure, steady as the tide. All the while, Hollow Creek ran on, hidden in moss and rain. Its crooked waters whispered the same truth it always had. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim remained to kneel at its banks, no ear bent to hear, yet its murmur was the seed of continents now bound in patience. Jonah's name was forgotten utterly, his lantern scattered to dust, but his fortune had long outgrown him. It had become the very rhythm of the earth itself. Storms rose, storms fell, rivers endured, and through that endurance civilizations no longer feared the dark horizon. They had found a fortune greater than gold, greater than conquest, greater even than memory, the wealth of patience, eternal as the river. The flow of patience swelled until it no longer belonged to nations or continents alone. It belonged to the world entire. The seas that once divided peoples now carried ships lit with lanterns, their steady flames signaling not conquest but kinship. Councils that had begun as gatherings of towns and then of nations became assemblies of the whole earth. Voices from every corner speaking slow and measured, weighing promises as carefully as stones laid in a riverbed. No crown presided, no empire ruled, only the current, the shared understanding that storms fade, rivers endure. Commerce no longer drove folk into frenzy. Instead, trade became covenant, each ledger entry a vow not just to profit but to endure together. A bushel of grain from one shore could carry a village through famine on another, and in return came iron, or timber, or trust itself. The emblem of flowing water was carved not just on coins but on buildings, banners, and seals of law. Children grew up reciting lessons where patience was praised higher than pride, and endurance held greater honor than brilliance. Culture bloomed brighter than lightning ever could. Lantern festivals circled the globe, nights when rivers of flame wound through valleys, streets, and harbors, so that from mountain to sea the world seemed stitched together by light. Songs in 100 tongues all carried the same refrain, each word different yet meaning the same. Storms fade, rivers endure. Poets called it the great current, priests called it the breath of creation, farmers called it simply the way, and in each name the truth held steady. Storms still came, wars flared, greed whispered, ambition hissed, but none of them lasted. The world had learned to wait, to endure, to hold steady until noise passed. And each time the storm faded, the current flowed stronger, drawing more people into its embrace. What once had been one man's quiet ledger now held the world in its pages. Back in the hidden valley, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked course through moss and stone. Rain fell soft, water whispered the same words it always had. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim came to hear, no monument marked its place, yet its murmur had become the hum of the earth itself. Jonah's name was gone, his lantern dust, but his fortune had never been about memory, it was about endurance. And now that endurance was the marrow of the world entire. Storms had their roar, but the world had found its river, and rivers, as they always do, endured. When the world had at last found its rhythm, steady as a tide and wide as the seas, men and women began looking beyond the sky. They built ships that could sail not on water but through the silence of the heavens, lanterns fixed to their bows so they carried the same steady glow into the dark. And when they went, they carried the creed with them, just as natural as breath. Their charts were careful, their voyages slow, their stores laid heavy with patience. They did not chase stars like storms, they followed them like rivers, flowing sure and steady into the unknown. Colonies rose on far-off stones, domes gleaming under strange suns, crops sprouting in soil never before touched by seed. Those who carried the river way thrived, keeping ledgers honest and barns full. They rationed steady when storms of silence and hunger pressed on them, and each time they endured. Other colonies, built on pride and haste, burned bright for a moment but faded quick, swallowed by the storms of their own greed. Word spread across the stars that patience was the only fortune that lasted, that no empire could outshine the quiet flow of a river-tended truth. Soon trade routes stretched between worlds like tributaries across a valley. Ships moved in steady lanes folk came to call currents, and their captains swore the same vows their ancestors had on earth. No deceit, no haste, no pride louder than patience. Councils of planets gathered, sitting in wide circles lit by lanterns, their voices slow, their promises firm. It wasn't conquest that bound them, nor fear, it was endurance, the simple knowledge that storms, no matter how vast, must fade, while rivers, no matter how quiet, endure. Culture grew new forms beneath alien skies, yet it carried the same refrain. Lantern festivals filled stations hanging in the dark, lights drifting through air like rivers of fireflies. Poets spoke of galaxies as rivers bending through eternity, their stars like droplets caught in the flow. Children laughed in recycled rain, taught that their joy was not just for a day, but for the patience of lifetimes. Even priests bowed before the hum of engines, calling it another form of the river song, proof that endurance could carry even through the void. And still, far away, Hollow Creek whispered through moss and stone. Its crooked waters spoke into silence. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one heard it, no one remembered, but its murmur had seeded colonies, bound planets, shaped the marrow of stars. Jonah's name was Dust, his lantern long gone, but his fortune burned in domes on alien worlds, in ledgers kept light years from his soil, in lanterns raised steady against the dark. Storms raged, as they always must, ships lost, disputes flaring, greed whispering in the dark. But none lasted. The river had crossed the sky itself, and in its patience humankind endured. The creed stretched wider still, until constellations themselves were bound together like tributaries flowing into a greater tide. Worlds that once thought of themselves as separate, divided by distance, tongue, and pride, began to see they were branches of the same current. They built vast councils, voices from 100 skies gathering in wings lit with lanterns. Decisions came slow as glaciers, yet once spoken, they endured longer than empires of old ever dreamed. The river had become more than practice or tradition. It was identity, the marrow that told whole constellations who they were. Trade bound them like arteries of light. Ships passed between stars in quiet lanes folk called currents, each captain sworn to keep their ledger steady and their lantern bright. Goods flowed, grain from domes on dry moons, metals from worlds of stone, water ferried from icy rings, and with them flowed trust. A broken promise was no small thing. It was a wound in the river itself, and no man wished to be remembered that way. Whole economies were built not on profit but on patience, not on haste but on endurance. Culture bloomed in colors no single world could have painted alone. Lantern festivals spanned planets, synchronized so that across light years rivers of flame seemed to move as one. Poets sang of galaxies as rivers, stars as droplets caught in their flow, constellations as bends in a current too wide to see. Priests on far-off worlds poured water on alien soil, blessing it with the same words whispered in forgotten valleys. Storms fade, rivers endure. Even children, born under suns Jonah never knew existed, grew up speaking the creed as if it had always been theirs. Storms still rose. Civil wars flared, markets faltered. Greed and ambition rattled like distant thunder. But no storm lasted long. The councils endured, the currents held, the river carried on. And each time the noise faded, the flow grew stronger, stretching wider, drawing more worlds into its embrace. The more distance the creed crossed, the more folk realized it was not just guidance, it was law as old as the stars themselves. And though none knew it, the crooked creek of Hollow Creek still whispered in moss and rain back on a forgotten earth. Its waters wound their way unseen, speaking the same murmur as always. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim stood there, no ear bent to listen, but its truth had become the lifeblood of constellations. Jonah's lantern was gone, his name long dissolved, but his fortune had grown vast as galaxies, carrying patience through the marrow of creation itself. Storms roared, as storms will, but they were nothing more than foam upon the tide. The river endured, wide as the heavens, eternal as breath. The riverway grew so deep in the marrow of living that folk no longer saw it as guidance alone. They began to speak of it as destiny itself. Councils of entire star clusters gathered in circles vast beyond reckoning, each lantern burning as part of a constellation of flame. Their debates were patient, their silences longer than storms themselves, yet their voices always found the same course: endure. They no longer asked whether the river was right, they asked only how to keep its flow true. It was not just custom, not just creed, it was the very path the cosmos seemed bent to follow. Merchants crossed the void with cargoes heavy not only with grain or metal, but with trust. Each contract bore the phrase as steady as the river, and to break it was to break one's same place in the current. Families kept ledgers that stretched back generations, numbers scratched neat across centuries, each line proof that patience outlives storms. Festivals of light no longer belonged to one world or one people, they circled through the heavens, rivers of flame drifting across domes, stations, and valleys on 100 worlds at once. The stars themselves seemed to glow with the rhythm, their constellations read as bends in an endless current. Culture turned wholly to endurance. Songs praised not thunder but still water, not brilliance but patience. Priests declared the river eternal, the breath of creation itself, humming through galaxies the way it once hummed through a quiet creek. Though it's whispered that every droplet was sacred, every lantern a flame of the same eternal fire. Even rulers who once sought storms of glory bowed to the creed. Their reigns were measured by how well they kept the current steady, how long they guided their people without breaking the flow. Storms did not vanish, they never do. Rebellions flared, greed whispered, pride rattled. Yet each storm was swallowed by the tide, dissolving before it could carve lasting ruin. The river was too wide now, too deep, too eternal to be shaken, and folk began to speak of the confluence. A day when every stream, every droplet, every patient act would merge into one ocean vast beyond imaginings. Some said it would be the end of all, others that it would be the revelation of what had always been. Whatever it meant, they trusted it, for the river had never lied. And all the while, back on the forgotten earth, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way through moss and rain. Its murmur was soft, unheard, yet it whispered the same refrain as always. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim remained to listen, yet its truth had crossed stars and ages. Jonah's name was long gone, his lantern dust, but his fortune was now the destiny of galaxies. The current he once scribbled into a ledger had become the marrow of creation itself. Storms roared, but they roared against eternity, and eternity, as always, endured. The notion of the confluence seeped into every tongue and every custom, until folk no longer asked if it would come, only when. Children were raised with stories of streams meeting in an ocean wide enough to cradle all things. Councils opened their gatherings not with boasts nor with banners, but with lanterns lit in silence, each flame a droplet of the great tide yet to be revealed. Farmers sowed seed in spirals instead of rows, patterns meant to mirror rivers bending toward a single sea. Poets wrote of galaxies not as scattered fires, but as tributaries curving toward one horizon. Even merchants, practical as stone, marked their ledgers with space left blank at the end, as if waiting for the day when no more numbers were needed. The confluence was not preached as end nor judgment. It was whispered as fulfillment, the moment when patience would reveal itself whole. Some imagined it as a light, others as silence, still others as a great merging of memory, where no voice was lost and no flame alone. But all agreed on one truth: it was not to be chased. The confluence could not be forced by storms, nor hastened by pride. It would come as rivers come to sea, quiet, steady, inevitable. And so they waited. Generations lived and died with that waiting as their marrow. Lantern festivals grew grander, whole star systems synchronizing so that light would ripple across the heavens like waves of flame. Families passed ledgers down not just as tools but as relics, proof that their patience had carved a place in the flow. Priests poured water on alien soil, whispering the refrain that tied all worlds together. Storms fade, rivers endure. Children asked when the confluence would come, and elders only smiled, saying, when the river wills it. Storms still rose, wars, greed, ambition, but none could shake the expectancy. If anything, each storm only deepened the faith, for storms had always faded, and rivers had always endured. Folk saw in every trial another sign that the tide was bending, that the confluence was drawing near. They no longer feared storms, for they believed they were droplets tumbling toward the same sea. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek still whispered unseen through moss and stone. Rain fell soft, soil drank deep, and the water hummed the same refrain as it had on the night Jonah first lifted his lantern. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim remained, no ear bent to hear, but the murmur had grown vast, a hum that carried through councils, through families, through stars themselves. Jonah's name was gone, his lantern dust, yet his fortune was alive in the expectancy of the confluence, in the marrow of civilizations waiting together for the tide. And so they endured, steady as ever, lanterns raised in patience, voices hushed in reverence. Storms would roar and fade, as storms always do. The river would carry on, as it always had. And somewhere ahead, in silence wider than eternity, the confluence waited. Signs of the confluence began to shimmer like faint lanterns in the fog, small, quiet, yet undeniable. Worlds light years apart started experiencing the same dreams, rivers bending, lanterns floating, a hush that carried more weight than thunder. Children who had never spoken to one another began humming the same tune, a melody with no words yet steady as breath. Farmers in distant systems sowed their seed on the same day without counsel or command, as though the soil itself had whispered the timing. Councils, vast beyond reckoning, found their debates ending in sudden agreement. Voices once divided now speaking as one. Merchants noticed it too. Ledgers across the stars began aligning, debts repaid in patterns no man had planned. Ships following separate routes arrived in harbors at the same hour, their captains staring at one another in quiet wonder. Even storms, fierce as ever, seemed to lose their teeth faster, dissolving into silence before they could cut deep. Folk called these happenings the first ripples of the confluence, proof that the river was drawing its streams closer. Poets seized on the signs, writing verses of droplets knowing their way without being told. Lanterns lightened before hands touched flame. Priests declared it was not prophecy but revelation, that the river had always been bending toward this horizon. Families gathered round tables and spoke softer than before, feeling that their patience was part of something greater than their own survival. Even children, when asked about the confluence, no longer asked when they said simply, "It is near." Storms still rose, loud and reckless. Pride still hissed. Greed still rattled. Yet none could shake the hush that had fallen across civilizations. The louder the storm, the quieter folk grew, listening for the current beneath the noise. And always they heard, steady, patient, eternal. They knew now that they were living, not at the edge of another storm, but at the edge of revelation. And still, Hollow Creek wound through its moss and stone, back on a forgotten earth. Rain tapped steady on its surface, roots drank, and the water whispered the same words as always. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one came to hear. No one remembered Jonah or his lantern, yet his murmur was alive in the marrow of constellations. His fortune had become the tide itself, and that tide was gathering, streams bending toward a sea unseen but certain. The signs grew stronger, undeniable as dawn. Lanterns lit across worlds at the same hour. Councils ended with the same refrain on every tongue. Storms fade, rivers endure. And in the silence that followed, folk knew the confluence was near. The confluence pressed closer, no longer a distant hope, but a tide touching daily life. Families who had never spoken across the stars began feeling the same impulses at the same hour. Lanterns raised in kitchens light years apart, hands reaching for ledgers to balance columns already made, even by unseen neighbors. Farmers found their fields yielding in harmony, rains falling in rhythms shared between worlds that had never known each other's skies. Children in one schoolroom began speaking words they had never been taught. Words echoed the same day in a village half a galaxy away. Folk could no longer deny it. They were being drawn closer, currents merging whether they willed it or not. Councils met, voices hushed, not to argue but to listen. Where once debates stretched for months, now decisions rose like rivers in flood, steady, unstoppable, unanimous, without explanation. Traders found themselves cutting deals without haggling, both sides offering the same terms before either had spoken. Priests bowed in silence, pouring water on stone with tears running down their cheeks, for they felt the river breathing through them. Poets threw aside their pens, declaring no verse could hold what was happening. Even rulers, once proud and thunderous, grew quiet, speaking softer, as though afraid to disturb the hush that now lay over the stars. Storms still flared, pride rattled, greed hissed, ambition roared, yet each storm seemed smaller, shorter, swallowed by the hush before it could truly begin. Folk began to see storms not as threats but as ripples, surface noise against a current too deep to move. Patience was no longer effort, it was essence. Endurance was no longer lesson, it was law. They were living, not beside the river, but within it, carried together toward a sea vast enough to cradle creation. Back in the valley no one remembered. Hollow Creek still murmured through moss and rain. Its crooked waters whispered the same refrain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No soul heard it, yet its hum had swelled into the marrow of galaxies. Jonah Lantern was dust, his ledger gone to rot, but the fortune he once scratched out by dim firelight now burned in stars themselves, in families drawn together by patience they could not name. The confluence was no longer future, it was present, dawning, unavoidable as sunrise. Folk felt it in their bones, in their breath, in the hush between storms. They whispered to each other not with fear, but with awe. Storms fade, rivers endure. And in those words they knew. They were no longer many streams. They were one river, and the sea was near. The confluence gathered like a flood no dam could hold. Streams of thought, streams of patience, streams of trust, All the currents carved across generations began drawing into one another. Folks who had never met felt as if they'd known each other always. Words grew fewer, for less was needed. A glance carried the weight of a speech. A silence carried the weight of an oath. Lanterns lit across countless worlds at the same hour, their flames flickering in unison as though the river itself had reached through the void to steady every hand. Children dreamed dreams not their own but shared, visions of rivers bending into oceans wider than stars. Elders woke in tears, recognizing faces of strangers as kin. Councils no longer debated, they listened, and in that hush, decisions rose complete, unbroken, undeniable. Merchants found ledgers balanced without writing, debts repaid by unseen hands before they could be asked. Farmers sowed fields in harmony with rains that fell across worlds, each droplet part of a rhythm too vast to map. It was no longer rumor, no longer hope. The confluence had arrived. Storms tried to rise, as storms always do. Pride flared in leaders clinging to crowns. Greed hissed in markets where old hunger still lingered. Ambition rattled in men who thought themselves larger than the tide. But each storm was swallowed before it could roar. Their noise dissolved in the patience of billions living as one flow. Storms had no foothold in an ocean they broke apart, leaving nothing but ripples. And so the world, the stars, the constellations themselves seemed to breathe in unison, each breath steady as the tide. Poets fell silent, calling words too small. Priests set aside sermons, kneeling before still water in awe. Rulers laid down their symbols of power, not from defeat, but from recognition that no crown outlasts the current. Families gathered close, lanterns between them, feeling no need to speak, for they were part of the same river now. It was as if all of creation had remembered what it had always been. Not many streams, but one. And still, on a forgotten earth, Hollow Creek wound through moss and stone. Rain pattered steady on its banks, roots drank deep, and the water whispered, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No pilgrim heard, no ear bent to listen, yet its murmur had grown into the voice of the cosmos. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was here, in the confluence, in the ocean of patience that cradled stars. Storms had roared for ages, and they still might rise again. But their time was over. The river had gathered, the river had endured, and in its endurance it had become the sea. The confluence, whole and vast, did not thunder as some had imagined. It came as a hush, a silence deeper than void, where every flame, every drop, every breath aligned into one rhythm. Folk felt it not with their ears, but with their marrow. It was as if the very bones of creation exhaled, and the river revealed its truest self. Not storm, not creed, not law, but the eternal pulse beneath all things. They realized then that what they had called patience, what they had called endurance, was not just a way of living, it was existence itself. Worlds once scattered felt themselves folded together, no longer apart but branches of the same stream. Families spoke without words, merchants traded without scales, rulers guided without crowns. There was no need for argument, no need for haste, no need for pride. The river carried them all, and in that carrying they were whole. Lanterns still burned, but they were no longer symbols. They were reflections of the eternal flame already humming in the dark. Ledgers still held neat rows of numbers, but they no longer measured debt. They measured gratitude. Each line a song of thanks to the current. Storms rose faint, shadows of what they once were. Pride whispered, greed rattled, ambition flickered. But they were like foam on an endless tide, dissolving before they could leave a mark. Folk no longer feared storms, they pitied them, knowing their roar was nothing against the sea. For the first time since the dawn of stories, the hush outlasted the noise. Poets, though silenced by awe, began to write again, but their verses were not of conquest or kings. They wrote of rivers bending into seas, of patience that stretched beyond stars, of lanterns that had always been part of a greater fire. Priests bowed not to altars but to the flow itself, declaring that eternity had always been the river's song. Children laughed, splashing in streams on worlds scattered light years apart, yet their laughter rose in harmony, one chorus sung across creation. And though no one knew it, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way through moss and rain back on earth, forgotten and unseen. Its waters whispered the same refrain: "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No voice heard it, no hand traced its banks, but it no longer mattered. That murmur had become the heartbeat of the confluence, the hum that carried through galaxies, through silence, through eternity. Jonah's name was dust, his lantern long gone, but his fortune had never been his alone. It was the river itself, revealed at last as the eternal rhythm of all. Storms had passed, rivers endured. And in that endurance, creation found its destiny, not thunder, not noise, but the steady flow of a patience too vast to end. From the stillness of the confluence came not an end, but a beginning. Folk had thought the great merging would close the story, a final chapter writ in water and flame. But the river, eternal as breath, revealed itself as more than endurance. It was renewal. In the hush of that vast tide, sparks stirred. New streams budded, not breaking away from the whole but rising out of it, as if the sea itself had chosen to scatter droplets back into the wide world. Creation, it seemed, was not finished. It was only turning its page. On worlds where lanterns burned in silence, children began speaking new words none had taught them, syllables that carried melodies fresh as dawn. Farmers planted in patterns unseen before, crops growing in spirals and arcs that mirrored currents deeper than any map. Merchants found themselves drawing up ledgers with columns that spoke not of gain nor loss, but of abundance yet unborn. Priests trembled in wonder, for their prayers were answered not with judgment, but with renewal. They whispered to their congregations that the river was not a circle closing, but a current bending forever forward. Storms tried once more to rise, as storms will. Pride flickered, greed hissed, ambition rattled, but the hush of the confluence made them small, faint as echoes in a canyon already filled with song. Folk no longer feared storms, they welcomed them as reminders of the old rhythm. For now they knew storms were part of the current too, noise that sharpened silence, shadows that proved the flame. Each storm faded quicker, leaving behind not scars but seeds. Culture shifted again, blossoming with the freshness of renewal. Poets wrote verses not of endings, but of beginnings, of rivers becoming seas and seas giving birth to rivers once more. Lantern festivals glowed brighter, flames lit not just to honor patience past, but to herald futures unborn. Families passed ledgers to their children, but the columns now ended with space left open, a promise that the flow would continue in hands yet to come. Even councils, vast and slow as glaciers, began to speak with a new tone, less final, more hopeful, like men and women who had glimpsed not the end of the road, but the bend where it carried on. And all the while, Hollow Creek whispered through moss and stone. Rain fell, roots drank, and the crooked waters hummed the same refrain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one heard, no one remembered Jonah, yet his murmur was alive in renewal itself. His lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune had become the very cycle of creation. Storms rise and fade, rivers carve and endure, seas gather and renew. The confluence was not an ocean to drown in, it was a tide to carry all things forward. What had endured would endure again, what had begun would begin again. The river was eternal, not in stillness but in the unbroken rhythm of renewal. Renewal spread like dawn breaking over a valley, soft at first, then undeniable. Worlds that had known only the patience of endurance now found themselves humming with fresh creation. New arts blossomed, not carved from pride but from gratitude. Painters filled their canvases with spirals and currents, colors flowing as if rivers themselves guided the brush. Musicians struck chords that echoed the hush of the confluence, tones layered like streams joining, harmonies so deep they made listeners weep without knowing why. Even storytellers changed their craft. They no longer told tales of storms defeated, but of rivers rising into seas, and seas pouring themselves back into new rivers again. Families felt the renewal in their marrow. Parents raised their children not only to endure but to create, encouraging them to shape lanterns in designs never seen, to tally ledgers that measured kindness as much as coin, to sow fields in ways that honored both soil and sky. Merchants began offering goods not as transactions alone, but as gifts woven into the river flow. A barrel of grain, a beam of timber, a basket of fruit, all were given with the knowledge they'd return multiplied, not by magic, but by trust renewed. Councils vast as galaxies spoke less of law and more of vision. They no longer asked how to protect themselves from storms. They asked how to guide renewal into forms that would outlast storms altogether. Their lantern circles glowed brighter, steady flames flickering with possibility, their silence holding not just endurance but expectation. They knew now that patience was not only surviving, it was creating, it was giving shape to futures unborn. Storms still came, faint and fleeting, trying to claw their way back into power. But folk met them with calm eyes, seeing them not as threats but as teachers. Every storm reminded them of the truth that had carried them so far. Storms fade, rivers endure. And each storm, once faded, left behind fertile ground for renewal. It was as if the storms themselves had been tamed, drawn into the river service. Poets declared that the cosmos had become a garden, the river its soil, the confluence its rain. Priests bowed in awe, saying the eternal had revealed itself not in thrones nor judgments, but in renewal without end. Children grew bold, laughing in the rain, splashing in streams on worlds new and old alike. They no longer asked when the river would end. They knew it never would. And back on Earth, Hollow Creek still wound its quiet way through moss and stone. Rain pattered, water whispered, the same refrain as always. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one heard, yet its murmur was alive in renewal across stars, in lanterns burning bright, in songs sung by voices that had never known its banks. Jonah Lantern was long gone, his ledger crumbled, but his fortune had risen anew, steady as dawn, endless as tide. The river had endured, the river had renewed, and in its renewal creation itself was born again. Renewal grew so wide and deep that it began to press against the very seams of time and space. Folk once believed the river creed guided only lives and nations, but now they saw its flow bending galaxies and stirring the fabric of the heavens themselves. Stars that had burned lonely for eons flared in harmony with one another, their light pulsing in the same rhythm as lanterns on distant worlds. Black voids that had seemed barren revealed streams of particles drifting slow, each joined in larger currents invisible to the eye but felt in the marrow. The river, it seemed, was not bound to soil nor to water nor even to life. It was stitched into the very skeleton of creation. Scholars, patient and steady, recorded patterns they had no words for. Clocks on different planets, once kept only by discipline, began falling into sync without cause. Seasons across entire systems shifted into harmony, as if harvest and planting were guided by one unseen hand. Families sitting at their tables on worlds light years apart found themselves bowing heads in silence at the same instant, feeling connected by a flow beyond distance. The confluence was no longer a matter of belief. It was physics, spirit, and destiny braided into one. Culture swelled to meet the wonder. Poets abandoned rhyme, writing instead in spirals that curved like galaxies. Musicians tuned their instruments to frequencies that echoed the pulse of suns, songs that reached not only ears but the spaces between them. Priests declared time itself was a river, every moment a droplet tumbling toward renewal. Councils, vast and solemn, spoke with a new humility. If time and space themselves bowed to the current, then their task was not to rule but to listen. Storms, when they rose, looked smaller than ever against such vastness. Pride rattled like dry reeds, greed flared like sparks, ambition roared like a gust of wind, loud for a moment, forgotten the next. Folk no longer wasted fear on storms. They watched them fade, then set their hands again to the work of renewal. What once had been trial was now reminder, proof that noise never lasts. And still on the forgotten earth, Hollow Creek wound through moss and stone. Its crooked waters whispered the same refrain: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No pilgrim bent to listen, yet its murmur had grown into the voice of time itself, the pulse of suns and seasons. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune had expanded past memory, past history, into the fabric of reality. The patience he once scratched into pages had become the rhythm of creation itself, a truth no storm could undo. The river had endured, the river had renewed. And now, the river was reshaping time and space, bending them into harmony with its eternal song. The river renewal seeped deeper still, not just through the fabric of time and space, but through the very marrow of every living being. Folk who had once thought themselves separate, different in shape, in tongue, in place, felt the same pulse thrumming in their hearts. Creatures on worlds where no human had set foot lifted their heads at the same hour, eyes gleaming with a quiet recognition. Beasts of soil and sky, fish of seas long hidden, even the smallest seeds stirring in shadow, all bent to the same rhythm. It was as if the river had reached out to gather every voice into one eternal chorus. Children were the first to notice. They laughed at the same jokes, though no words were shared. They sang songs they could not have learned from parents or teachers, their games echoing one another across worlds. Elders followed, dreaming the same visions of lanterns floating downstream, of ledgers filled with endless space, of rivers bending toward a sea wider than thought. Farmers swore their animals moved with purpose, crops sprouting in shapes that mirrored constellations. Priests wept openly in their temples, for their prayers were answered not in thunder nor in silence, but in the shared heartbeat of all things. Councils, vast as galaxies, could no longer tell where debate ended and chorus began. Voices rose, not in conflict but in harmony, decisions unfolding like verses of a song everyone already knew. Merchants tallied their ledgers and found not only debts and gains but gratitude written between the lines, a wealth measured not in coin but in connection. Soldiers laid aside arms, not by treaty but by recognition that their hands were meant for building, not for tearing. Storms still tried to claw their way back. Pride hissed, greed rattled, ambition roared, but against the chorus they were nothing more than faint disharmony, resolved before it could sour the tune. Folk no longer resisted storms in fear, they absorbed them, turned their noise into new notes, weaving thunder into harmony itself. Culture swelled into wonder. Poets abandoned parchment, carving spirals into stone and light, shapes that mirrored the current they felt within. Musicians tuned their instruments to the very hum of their blood, playing not for audience but for creation itself. Lantern festivals became living rivers of flame, families on 1,000 worlds sending their lights downstream into oceans that no storm could darken. Renewal was no longer event nor promise, it was life itself. And back on earth, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way through moss and rain. Its waters whispered steady and soft, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No ear bent to listen, no pilgrim knelt at its banks, yet its murmur was everywhere. In the chorus of children, in the dreams of elders, in the heartbeat of creation itself. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune had expanded past memory, past history, into the fabric of reality. The patience he once scratched into pages had become the rhythm of creation itself, a truth no storm could undo. The river had endured, the river had renewed, and now the river was reshaping time and space, bending them into harmony with its eternal song. The river renewal seeped deeper still, not just through the fabric of time and space, but through the very marrow of every living being. Folk who had once thought themselves separate, different in shape, in tongue, in place, felt the same pulse thrumming in their hearts. Creatures on worlds where no human had set foot lifted their heads at the same hour, eyes gleaming with a quiet recognition. Beasts of soil and sky, fish of seas long hidden, even the smallest seeds stirring in shadow, all bent to the same rhythm. It was as if the river had reached out to gather every voice into one eternal chorus. Children were the first to notice. They laughed at the same jokes, though no words were shared. They sang songs they could not have learned from parents or teachers, their games echoing one another across worlds. Elders followed, dreaming the same visions of lanterns floating downstream, of ledgers filled with endless space, of rivers bending toward a sea wider than thought. Farmers swore their animals moved with purpose, crops sprouting in shapes that mirrored constellations. Priests wept openly in their temples, for their prayers were answered not in thunder nor in silence, but in the shared heartbeat of all things. Councils, vast as galaxies, could no longer tell where debate ended and chorus began. Voices rose not in conflict but in harmony, decisions unfolding like verses of a song everyone already knew. Merchants tallied their ledgers and found not only debts and gains but gratitude written between the lines, a wealth measured not in coin but in connection. Soldiers laid aside arms, not by treaty but by recognition that their hands were meant for building, not for tearing. Storms still. Children sensed it first, fallen silent in their play, to stare at streams or lantern flames, eyes wide with wonder at something they could not name. Elders, sitting in their chairs with ledgers closed, breathed slow and deep, tears tracking their cheeks as they recognized the hush they had felt all their lives, but never spoken. Priests ceased their sermons, choosing instead to kneel in silence. Temples filled with worshipers who found the quiet more holy than any prayer. Even councils, grand and solemn, sat wordless for hours, voting not with speeches but with still lanterns, their flames speaking more than voices ever could. Storms still flickered, but they were nothing more than ripples on the surface of the hush. Pride rattled faint as dry leaves, greed sparked like a match snuffed by rain, ambition howled but faded into the quiet as though ashamed of its own noise. Folk no longer braced against storms, they let them pass through, their silence unbroken, their patience untouchable. The chorus was still there, strong and steady, but it rested now on silence, like a river carried by its bed of stone. Culture shifted to reflect the hush. Poets laid down their pens entirely, claiming that silence itself was the poem. Musicians began to play single notes, stretched long until the air itself trembled. letting the space between sounds hold the meaning. Families gathered around lanterns and spoke less, their comfort found not in words but in the simple presence of one another. Festivals of light grew quieter, rivers of flame drifting downstream with no song, only the sound of water and the hush of countless souls watching. And still, Hollow Creek wound its way unseen through moss and rain. Its crooked waters whispered as they always had, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Yet now, its murmur was not only echoed in voices or songs, it was reflected in the silence between them. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune lived on in the stillness that underpinned every chorus, every flame, every flow. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, and now the river was stillness, the eternal hush that carried all things in its patient embrace. From the stillness rose something no one had expected. Folk thought silence would be the final harbor, the bed where all rivers rest. Yet in that hush, seeds began to stir. It was not an end but a foundation, a soil richer than any field, holding the promise of new rivers yet unborn. Out of the quiet, creation began to breathe again. Not in thunder, not in storm, but in the faint stir of renewal rising from the hush itself. The river was showing that stillness was not death, it was the womb of beginnings. Children, sitting quiet with lanterns in their hands, started to hum soft tunes that none had taught them. Elders, who thought their days of sowing were over, dreamed of streams they had never seen, bending toward horizons untouched. Families opened ledgers and found their columns stretching forward, not as debts or gains, but as blank lines waiting to be filled by hands unborn. Councils, vast and ancient, began to speak again, but with new tones, hopeful, gentle, like dawn pushing against the edge of night. Storms tried their hand as they always did. Pride rattled, greed hissed, ambition sparked, but in the hush they found no foothold. Their noise was swallowed before it could echo. Folk no longer feared storms nor even pitied them. They saw storms as shadows cast by light not yet born. Each gust of noise was met with patience, each flicker of greed absorbed into the stillness, each roar of ambition turned quiet by the chorus of renewal rising from silence. Culture blossomed anew, tender but certain. Poets picked up their pens again, writing not of conquest nor endurance, but of births yet unseen, of rivers rising from oceans of quiet. Musicians played notes that bent into melodies never heard before, songs that carried both hush and flow, both stillness and renewal. Lantern festivals grew brighter once more, their flames lifted not in mourning but in expectation. Rivers of fire drifted downstream, mirrored by stars above, both testaments that silence was not final, it was fertile. And back on earth, Hollow Creek whispered on, its waters murmur as steady as ever, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No one stood to listen, yet its refrain had become the eternal cycle of creation. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune lived on in every new stream rising from stillness, in every flame lit against the dark, in every ledger opened with lines waiting for tomorrow. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, and now the river was birthing anew, carrying all creation forward on tides that would never cease. From the fertile hush, the new beginnings grew bold, rising like streams breaking free of hidden springs. What started as murmurs in the silence swelled into full rivers, each one carrying the patience of ages yet flowing with fresh strength. Worlds that had long lived steady now felt the thrill of creation without abandoning their creed. They built new cities, not from conquest but from renewal, their streets curving like tributaries joining a greater flow. Lanterns burned brighter not only to honor the past but to light paths no one had yet walked. The river was teaching that endurance was not stagnation, it was the soil from which fresh wonders could rise. Children were at the heart of it. They laughed in ways that seemed to carry the hush of stillness and the flow of song together. Their play turned into rituals of renewal, games that mirrored the birth of rivers, dances that looked like spirals bending toward a sea. Elders, once thought to be at the end of their course, found new vigor in guiding these streams, their wisdom flowing into beginnings like rain into springs. Families passed ledgers to the next generation, columns not only carrying old patience but stretching forward, blank and beckoning, ready to be filled with new trust. Councils, vast as ever, turned from merely preserving the current to shaping it. They debated not how to endure storms they had learned that long ago, but how to channel renewal so that rivers carved valleys fertile for centuries. Their lantern circles glowed with purpose, each flame marking both memory and possibility. Merchants followed suit, trading not just goods but visions. Contracts promised not only fair scales but shared futures. Ventures planted like orchards meant to feed generations unborn. Storms rose faintly, as storms always will. Pride tried to claim new rivers as its own. Greed whispered promises of faster flow. Ambition rattled with dreams of control. Yet each storm faded before patience, its roar dissolving into renewal. Folk had learned too well that storms pass, but rivers endure. And now they saw that rivers not only endure, they multiply, they refresh, they rise anew. Culture burst with energy. Poets penned verses that spiraled across pages, their words flowing like water across stone, describing beginnings birthed from endings. Musicians wove silence and song together, playing notes that carried both the memory of hush and the thrill of renewal. Festivals of lanterns grew grander still, flames drifting in rivers that curved and split and rejoined, showing that every stream, no matter how new, was part of the eternal tide. And in the forgotten valley, Hollow Creek still wound through moss and rain. Its crooked waters whispered the same refrain: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No ear heard, no pilgrim stood, but its murmur had become the cycle of eternity, endurance, renewal, song, stillness, and beginnings without end. Jonah's lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was alive in every new stream rising from the hush, in every flame carried forward, in every ledger filled anew. The river had endured, the river had sung, the river had stilled, and now the river was rising again, streams spilling into creation with fresh patience and unbroken strength. The new rivers, bold and bright, did not wander aimless. They wound together, bending and crossing, braiding themselves into vast patterns no single eye could grasp. What seemed like chance at first, the joining of streams, the curving of courses, revealed itself as design, a tapestry stretching wider than stars. Worlds felt their place in it, not as specks lost in void, but as threads woven into something greater. Each river was unique, yet everyone flowed toward a destiny shared, a creation shaped not by storms nor by pride, but by patient hands guiding the current. Children traced the patterns without knowing. They stacked stones in spirals by creeks, drew lines in sand that mirrored galaxies, hummed tunes that matched the pulse of distant rivers. Elders watching in silence recognized in those games the truth they'd carried all their lives. The river was not only endurance, not only renewal, but design. Families kept ledgers where columns no longer just tallied grain and coin, but mapped patterns, cycles of giving, rhythms of trust, shapes of lives intertwining like tributaries. Councils, sitting in their lantern-lit circles, came to see themselves not as rulers but as stewards of the weave. They realized laws were not commands but banks that shaped flow, guiding rivers so they carved valleys rich for all. Their silence grew deeper, their words fewer, but their decisions carried further, for they were no longer speaking as men alone, they were echoing the pattern itself. Merchants, too, saw their role anew, not hunters of profit but weavers of currents, their trade routes stitching together streams into a fabric that held whole nations. Storms, faint as ever, tried to unravel the weave. Pride strained to cut rivers loose. Greed pulled at threads. Ambition tried to twist patterns to its own design. Yet each storm failed. The rivers rejoined, stronger for their bending. Folk no longer feared storms unraveling the whole. They saw storms as tests that revealed the weave's strength. Even thunder now seemed part of the pattern, noise that proved the depth of the silence beneath. Culture reflected the revelation. Poets no longer wrote in straight lines but in spirals and lattices, words scattering like droplets and then gathering again. Musicians layered notes that wound round one another like streams, melodies rising, merging, parting, rejoining, till the song mirrored the very weave itself. Lantern festivals grew into vast braids of light, rivers of flame splitting and meeting, showing families and strangers alike that their streams, however different, belonged to the same design. And far away, Hollow Creek still whispered through moss and stone. Its crooked waters, meandering and bending, were the first small picture of what creation had now revealed. Rivers do not wander by accident, they weave. The creek murmur carried the same refrain: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one stood to hear, but its voice was alive in the patterns of galaxies, in the ledgers of families, in the lanterns drifting down braids of flame. Jonah's lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was now the very weave of creation. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen again, and now the river was weaving, braiding every stream into destiny itself. The weave of rivers stretched wider than thought, braiding streams into shapes so vast they could only be glimpsed in pieces. Yet folk began to sense it, not with eyes alone, but with the marrow of their bones. Patterns revealed themselves in lanterns drifting downstream, in ledgers filled with quiet columns, in the laughter of children playing across worlds. It was as though all of creation had been stitched by patient hands into a single tapestry, each droplet a thread, each river a line, each life a part of the whole. The river was no longer just flowing, it was revealing the shape of eternity itself. Children pointed to the stars and traced spirals that matched the bends of their own streams. Elders who had kept patience their whole lives smiled as they recognized the grand design they had only ever felt. Families passed down ledgers not only as records of trust but as maps of the weave, proof that their choices had become part of a pattern larger than themselves. Councils sat in silence, lanterns burning, knowing their voices were no longer theirs alone but echoes of eternity speaking through them. Merchants too felt it. Their trade routes, once lines of profit, now gleamed as threads in the grand design. They carried not just grain and goods but meaning, stitching together currents across the breadth of stars. Soldiers who once marched in noise now laid their arms aside, realizing the weave had no place for breaking threads. They became guardians instead, keepers of the flow, standing watch not to conquer but to preserve. Storms rose faint as they always had, but they looked different now. Pride tried to pull loose, greed tried to tangle, ambition rattled at the edges, but none could shake the whole. The weave held firm, every storm swallowed into its vastness. Folk stopped asking when storms would end, for they understood now storms were never threats to eternity. They were shadows that proved its light. Culture bloomed like never before. Poets wrote verses in circles, spirals, lattices, their words scattering like droplets then rejoining in harmony. Musicians composed symphonies that layered streams of sound into a fabric so deep it seemed to hum with the voice of creation. Festivals of lanterns grew vast, rivers of flame bending and twinning, families standing silent as they watched their lights braid into the eternal pattern. It was no longer celebration alone, it was revelation. And in the forgotten valley, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way through moss and rain. Its bends, meandering and patient, mirrored the shape of the weave now stretching across galaxies. Its waters whispered as they always had, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." No one heard, no pilgrim knelt at its banks, yet its murmur had become the very voice of eternity. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was alive in the pattern itself, in the shape of a destiny no storm could undo. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen again, and now the river was weaving, braiding every stream into destiny itself. The weave of rivers stretched wider than thought, braiding streams into shapes so vast they could only be glimpsed in pieces. Yet folk began to sense it, not with eyes alone but with the marrow of their bones. Patterns revealed themselves in lanterns drifting downstream, in ledgers filled with quiet columns, in the laughter of children playing across worlds. It was as though all of creation had been stitched by patient hands into a single tapestry, each droplet a thread, each river a line, each life a part of the whole. The river was no longer just flowing, it was revealing the shape of eternity itself. Children pointed to the stars and traced spirals that matched the bends of their own streams. Elders who had kept patience their whole lives smiled as they recognized the grand design they had only ever felt. Families passed down ledgers not only as records of trust, but as maps of the weave, proof that their choices had become part of a pattern larger than themselves. Councils sat in silence, lanterns burning, knowing their voices were no longer theirs alone, but echoes of eternity speaking through them. Merchants too felt it. Their trade routes, once lines of profit, now gleamed as threads in the grand design. They carried not just grain and goods, but meaning, stitching together currents across the breadth of stars. Soldiers who once marched in noise now laid their arms aside, realizing the weave had no place for breaking threads. They became guardians instead, keepers of the flow, standing watch not to conquer but to preserve. Storms rose faint as they always had, but they looked different now. Pride tried to pull loose, greed tried to tangle, ambition rattled at the edges, but none could shake the whole. The weave held firm, every storm swallowed into its vastness. Folk stopped asking when storms would end, for they understood now storms were never threats to eternity. They were shadows that proved its light. Culture bloomed like never before. Poets wrote verses in circles, spirals, lattices, their words scattering like droplets then rejoining in harmony. Musicians composed symphonies that layered streams of sound into a fabric so deep it seemed to hum with the voice of creation. Festivals of lanterns grew vast, rivers of flame bending and twinning. Families standing silent as they watched their lights braid into the eternal pattern. It was no longer celebration alone, it was revelation. And in the forgotten valley, Hollow Creek still wound its crooked way through moss and rain. Its bends, meandering and patient, mirrored the shape of the weave now stretching across galaxies. Its waters whispered as they always had. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one heard, no pilgrim knelt at its banks, yet its murmur had become the very voice of eternity. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was alive in the pattern itself, in the shape of a destiny no storm could undo. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen again, the river had woven, and now the river was eternity, a pattern wide enough to cradle all creation. The eternal weave, vast and steady, began to fold back upon itself, revealing truths older than memory. Folk saw that the threads they thought were endings were also beginnings, and that the patterns they thought were new had always been part of the design. Lanterns floated downstream only to rise again as stars. Rivers bent into seas only to spring forth once more as streams. Time itself curved, not as a line nor as a circle, but as a flow without start or finish. The river was showing that there was no difference between what began and what ended. They were one and the same, carried together in its eternal current. Children, with their bright eyes and endless laughter, seemed to carry memories beyond their years. They told stories of storms their ancestors had weathered as if they had lived them themselves. Elders, sitting in the hush of lantern light, spoke not of leaving but of returning, confident their streams would rise again in new forms. Families opened ledgers and realized the first lines mirrored the last, each generation writing the same truths with fresh hands. Councils sat in awe, no longer drafting laws for the future alone, but acknowledging that the future was also the past, folded into one river without edges. Merchants came to see their trade as more than exchange. It was continuation. A sack of grain passed from hand to hand was not just provision, but proof that beginnings were born in endings. Farmers, sowing fields, saw last season's harvest not as gone, but as foundation for the new. Soldiers, their weapons long laid aside, tended gardens and streams, protecting not borders but the endless flow of the cycle. Storms flickered faint, but now they seemed almost tender, like reminders that without endings, beginnings would lose their shape. Pride rattled but faded into humility, greed sparked but dissolved into generosity, ambition roared but turned into vision. Folk did not resist storms anymore. They welcomed them, knowing each storm was a bend in the flow, shaping the eternal weave. Culture shifted to embrace the cycle. Poets wrote verses that began and ended on the same line, words flowing in loops that mirrored rivers returning to their source. Musicians played songs with no final note, each melody dissolving into silence only to rise again as the first chord. Lantern festivals grew quieter, their rivers of flame curving back upon themselves, circles of light drifting endlessly with no break. Renewal was no longer seen as separate from stillness, song no longer separate from hush. They were one truth expressed in many ways. And in the forgotten valley, Hollow Creek still whispered through moss and stone. Its crooked waters curved and folded, vanishing into the earth only to rise again downstream. Its murmur carried the same refrain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one listened, no one remembered, yet its song was alive in the eternal weave, in the cycle of beginnings and endings that were never apart. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune had become the rhythm of eternity itself. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen again, the river had woven, and now the river was eternity, a pattern wide enough to cradle all creation. The eternal weave, vast and steady, began to fold back upon itself, revealing truths older than memory. Folks saw that the threads they thought were endings were also beginnings, and that the patterns they thought were new had always been part of the design. Lanterns floated downstream only to rise again as stars. Rivers bent into seas only to spring forth once more as streams. Time itself curved, not as a line nor as a circle, but as a flow without start or finish. The river was showing that there was no difference between what began and what ended. They were one and the same, carried together in its eternal current. Children, with their bright eyes and endless laughter, seemed to carry memories beyond their years. They told stories of storms their ancestors had weathered as if they had lived them themselves. Elders, sitting in the hush of lantern light, spoke not of leaving but of returning, confident their streams would rise again in new forms. Families opened ledgers and realized the first lines mirrored the last, each generation writing the same truths with fresh hands. Councils sat in awe, no longer drafting laws for the future alone, but acknowledging that the future was also the past, folded into one river without edges. Merchants came to see their trade as more than exchange. It was continuation. A sack of grain passed from hand to hand was not just provision, but proof that beginnings were born in endings. Farmers sowing fields saw last season's harvest not as gone, but as foundation for the new. Soldiers, their weapons long laid aside, tended gardens and streams, protecting not borders but the endless flow of the cycle. Storms flickered faint, but now they seemed almost tender, like reminders that without endings, beginnings would lose their shape. Pride rattled but faded into humility. Greed sparked but dissolved into generosity. Ambition roared but turned into vision. Folk did not resist storms anymore. They welcomed them, knowing each storm was a bend in the flow, shaping the eternal weave. Culture shifted to embrace the cycle. Poets wrote verses that began and ended on the same line, words flowing in loops that mirrored rivers returning to their source. Musicians played songs with no final note, each melody dissolving into silence only to rise again as the first chord. Lantern festivals grew quieter, their rivers of flame curving back upon themselves, circles of light drifting endlessly with no break. Renewal was no longer seen as separate from stillness, song no longer separate from hush. They were one truth expressed in many ways. And in the forgotten valley, Hollow Creek still whispered through moss and stone. Its crooked waters curved and folded, vanishing into the earth only to rise again downstream. Its murmur carried the same refrain: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one listened, no pilgrim knelt, yet its voice was alive in every world, every lantern, every ledger. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was the very cycle now lived by creation. Storm and stillness, renewal and song, beginning and end, one unbroken river. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen, the river had woven, the river had become eternity. And now, the river was inheritance, the eternal gift passed from generation to generation, steady as breath, unbroken as tide. The unborn generations rose into their inheritance like seedlings reaching toward sunlight. They did not need to be convinced of the river truth. It was already in their marrow, passed down in lullabies, in ledgers, in lantern light. Children grew into youth with patience stitched into their bones, their laughter steady, their dreams vast as skies. They saw no divide between what was and what would be, for to them the flow was seamless, beginnings and endings folding into one. Where their ancestors had clung to endurance through storms, these new generations stepped forward with calm assurance, knowing the river would carry them. Storms themselves became storytellers. Pride thundered, greed hissed, ambition rattled, yet folk no longer cast these out, they listened. Storms told tales of shadow and hunger, of missteps and mismeasures, of the bends rivers must take to find their course. Each roar was folded into the larger saga. Each hush after storm proof that the river story was never broken. Culture became holy narration. Festivals of lanterns were gatherings of chapters, millions of flames telling one book. Songs no longer sought endings. They flowed open, spiraling back into beginnings, every note both start and close. Families told their children not just bedtime stories, but the truth. You are the story, and the river tells itself through you. Renewal, stillness, storm, and song were seen as verses of one endless hymn. And in the valley, Hollow Creek whispered still, crooked and patient. Its refrain was unchanged: don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one bent to listen, but its murmur was the first sentence, the root of every tale told by campfire and council, by poet and priest. Jonah Lantern was gone, his ledger dust, but his fortune was alive in every voice, every silence, every flame that carried the story forward without end. The river had endured, the river had renewed, the river had sung, the river had stilled, the river had risen, the river had woven, the river had become eternity, the river had become inheritance, the river had become future, the river had become horizon, the river had become breath, the river had become truth, the river had become flesh, the river had become civilization. The river had become galaxy. The river had become ocean. The river had become unity. The river had become flame. The river had become story. And now, the river was narrator itself, speaker, listener, silence, and word, all one, eternal, and unbroken.